I was hired about 12 years ago to trap and hunt these wild hogs that has been plaguing this farmer's land for quite some time. If you know anything about hogs, is that they can get quite big, and they're very aggressive. What I would typically do, and what I've done in the past, is I'd set up random traps around the property. These traps would basically be a circular fence about 30 feet in diameter. The fence would have a gate that would close shut after a certain amount of hogs would be in the trap. I set up 3 traps like this on the property in order to maximize what I could catch. I set up my traps and I waited through the night to see what I would catch. The next morning I took my horse out and checked the traps. The first 2 were empty. The last trap had about 7 hogs in it, all of which were pretty good size. I didn't do anything with the last trap, and I left the hogs alone. In order for me to reset the trap, I'd have to kill all of the hogs, haul them out of there, and reset it. I would not be able to haul all of the hogs out with just my horse. I'd need my truck for that. I rode my horse back, dropped it off, and picked up my truck, and went out for the 3rd trap. Upon arriving to the 3rd trap, the hogs were in a frenzy. Something must have stirred them up while I was gone. I noticed that some of the hogs were injured and had blood on them. This wasn't necessarily surprising. Hogs would not only injure but also kill and eat other hogs, if given the chance. But upon counting the hogs, I noticed that 2 of them had gone missing. Instead of 7 hogs, there were only 5. My only conclusion was that I either miscounted, or 2 of them had escaped. At this point, it didn't even cross my mind that something had taken them. The only animal that I could think of that could do that was maybe a bear, which we weren't in bear country, so I figured that I just miscounted. I killed the 5 hogs, reloaded the trap, and loaded the hogs back into my truck. I had a special ramp on the back of my truck bed that I'd use to pull the hogs into. Some of these hogs weighed 200 pounds, and there's no way I could do this by myself unless I had a ramp. I drove back and checked the other 2 traps before calling it a day. To be honest, I was kind of confused about the 2 missing hogs. Did I really miscount? I can understand if it was 20 or 30 hogs, but 7? 7 isn't that high of a number. At this point, my common sense told me that these 2 hogs just slipped away, and that was that. The next day came and I checked the traps again on horseback. The first 2 traps had hogs in them, which was really good news. The first one only had 4, while the second one had 12. What this meant was that the hogs were being drawn out from the woods, coming closer and closer to my traps, and falling for it. This made my job a lot easier. I went and checked my 3rd and final trap, the trap that was the deepest in the woods, and to my surprise, there weren't any hogs inside of it. I was quite surprised that there weren't any hogs in this trap. If there were to be a trap that had hogs in it, it'd be this one. After quickly inspecting the trap, I noticed that the trap had shut, meaning something had triggered it, but there weren't any hogs inside. When I went to reset the trap, I noticed bits and pieces of hogs all over the inside of the trap. Normally when hogs eat one another, there's a remaining hog standing, a last survivor. What had eaten these hogs, and more importantly, how did it get out of the trap? The trap's fence was about 7 feet tall, even tall for me. Granted, the fence was chain linked, meaning that I could climb out of it, but I don't know of any animal that could do that. Some animal jumping 7 feet that lives in America doesn't sound realistic. Again, I was confused about this 3rd trap, but then again I just reset the trap and went about my day. The 3rd day came and I checked the traps again. The first 2 traps in total had 20 hogs. I was quite anxious to see what the 3rd trap would have. For a 2nd day in a row, the trap had been closed, but there were no hogs inside. Again, there were bits and pieces of hogs that remained, but no live ones. Something must have been eating them. I checked the inside of the traps for tracks of any kind, but the hogs' footprints had damaged the soil too much that I couldn't see anything. It finally clicked in my mind that it was probably a cougar, a large one. I asked the farmer for permission to hunt the cougar at night, which he agreed. He didn't want the cougar eating any of his livestock. I reset all 3 traps, and I waited for nightfall. Cougars are nocturnal animals, for the most part, and like to hunt at night. I decided that riding my horse out would be the best option. My truck would be too distracting and would scare off the cougar. I waited till 1 a.m. to go hunting. This would give my traps enough time to catch some hogs, which would be perfect bait for this cougar. 1 a.m. came around and I took off on horseback. All I brought with me was my rifle and a heavy-duty flashlight. This was before the time of smartphones, and I obviously didn't own any night vision goggles. Looking back, this was really dumb. At the very least, I should at least brought someone with me. But I didn't. I rode past the first 2 traps and on my way to the third one when I started to hear the sounds of wild hogs squealing. I knew that I was right on time to catch the cougar in the act. I quickly rode out to the third trap, flashlight in hand. When I first arrived to the trap, I didn't know what I was looking at. All I saw were wild hogs running around crazily inside the trap. However, I did notice something very large inside that didn't look like a hog. Instead of pulling out my rifle, I just sat there looking at what kind of creature was inside this trap. My flashlight must have caught the creature's attention, and it stopped what it was doing and stood up. The best way I could describe it was that it was like a dog, but also human at the same time. Its features resembled that of a werewolf or a very large dog standing on 2 legs, and I was completely terrified. My horse, being confused and frightened, took off back the way we came. I could see now that the creature was ignoring the hogs, and its attention was on us. I heard the sound of something jumping over a fence and giving chase behind us. I urged my horse to run faster, but it was too slow for this thing. The creature made a couple swipes at my horse, which my horse reacted in pain. My horse had significantly slowed, and the creature was able to gain. The creature tackled the horse from behind, causing me to be bucked off. My horse and my rifle were now in the clutches of this large beast. The beast was now eating my horse, and I had no choice but to run. Thankfully, I wasn't too far away, and I was able to make it back safely. The creature seemed to be pretty satisfied with my horse, and thankfully it didn't chase me. If it did, I would not be able to be here today, telling you my story. I was running late due to traffic, and I missed my flight for a business meeting. My options were that I could stay in the airport for another 12 hours, catch another flight, or I could drive there. I put the destination into my phone. Google told me that it would take about 8 hours to get there. Being the adventurous type, I figured that a road trip across a couple of states I've never been to would be a lot of fun. So I decided, road trip it was. I stopped at the nearest gas station, topped off my car with gas, loaded up energy drinks and snacks for the road, and found a cool audio tape to listen to. I was set for a fun road trip. I took off on my road trip and didn't think twice. The audiobook was amazing, and the energy drinks, they did their job. I had to stop twice to fill up on gas. Both gas stations I stopped at were at well-populated areas. Not only did I fill up on gas, but I made sure to also get more energy drinks. But I also found another audiobook to listen to. The audiobook was some kind of horror story. It was the only option they had. I personally prefer mysteries or even true crime, but I figured that horror was close enough. I guess it beats listening to local radio stations. I started off the last leg of my trip, and it was starting to get dark. It turns out that the audiobook was really good. 2 hours had passed and I had hardly noticed. But what I did notice was a light on my dashboard. Low fuel. Great. I typed into Google the nearest gas station, which was unfortunately about 40 miles away. Typically, when you see the low fuel light turn on, you have about 20 miles, until you're completely empty. As I kept driving, and by the grace of God, I saw a sign that said fuel station, 16 miles. The fuel station must have been a part of a small town, a town so small that it didn't appear on Google, which I thought was really odd. I took the exit that the fuel station was on, and it took me down this really dark road. The road had little to no lighting. It looked like I was driving to the middle of nowhere. I was eventually able to see some lights, and I pulled into this small town. The small town had about 5 or 6 small buildings, all of which with their lights still on. I found the gas station and I pulled in. The gas prices were unusually low, which made me think that this gas station wasn't updated. I got out and tried to fuel up my car, but nothing. I then decided to walk inside the gas station and try to find an attendant of some kind. But once inside the gas station, I noticed that it was deserted. All that remained inside, other than some empty racks, was a desk with a small register on it. I went back outside and I walked over next door. Next door appeared to be what looked like a small motel. Surely there had to be people there. I walked into the front desk area. No one was there, but I couldn't help but notice all of these stains all over the floor. The carpet was this hideous brown, but I couldn't help but notice these darker spots that seemed to cover the floor. Some of the stains were even on the walls. I wasn't sure if it was because I was in a town I wasn't familiar with and there wasn't anyone here, or because I was listening to a horror audiobook before this, but I was starting to feel uneasy. Why did these buildings have power if no one was there? While in the motel office, I went to look outside the window to my car, and I saw something that made my heart stop. Standing next to my car was this skinny yet feral looking creature. It was about 7 feet tall and was covered with this matted hair. The best way to describe it was that it looked like the werewolf in the third Harry Potter, except this one was missing an arm. I had to double take at what I was looking at. I wasn't sure if it was my mind or maybe the lighting that was playing tricks on me, but sure enough, when I looked again, it was still there. The creature then went inside the gas station, which I assumed was to look for me. At this moment, I had a decision to make. Either I hid inside this motel, or I made a break for it and tried to get inside my car to drive off. But even if I got inside my car before this creature got me, I would only be able to drive a couple miles away before my gas would run out. I decided that hiding would be the best option, and I looked for keys for a motel room inside of the office. There were only 4 keys available, so I grabbed all of them, and I sprinted outside to the motel rooms. I ran into the first motel room I could find. Inside of the room laid a startling sight. The remains of what looked like 2 people were scattered all over the room. Stains that much resembled what I saw in the office covered the floor and walls in this room, even part of the ceiling. I ran out of this room, leaving the door open and the lights on, and I ran into the next room. The next room was thankfully cleaner. However, there were still stains covering the floors and walls. I decided that this would have to do, so I locked the door behind me, turned off the lights, and I hid under the bed. It didn't take long before I started hearing noises in the first room. I could hear loud huffing and furniture being moved. I was fairly certain that the wolf thing was looking for me. Despite the creature not having an arm, I was fairly certain that whatever this thing was would be very able to kill me quite easily. The sounds in the first room had stopped. I then started to hear creaking coming outside my door, and the sound of the door handle jingling. I held my breath just to make sure that this thing wouldn't be able to hear me. After a few minutes of messing with my door, the creature then left and went to the next room. I decided that now would be the best time to make a break for it, and I slowly crawled out from under the bed. The sounds in the next room confirmed that the creature was definitely busy, so I slowly opened the door and tiptoed my way back. As I was slowly moving back, I stepped on the floorboard and it let out a creak. The sounds in the other room had stopped abruptly. I didn't wait to see what would happen, so I just sprinted towards my car. The 30 seconds that it took me to get back to my car had felt like hours. The adrenaline caused my heart to beat uncontrollably, and I was completely motivated by fear. I was able to enter my car and lock it before I felt a huge hit come from behind me. In any other circumstance, I would think that this would have been a car, but I knew that it was the creature. I turned my car on and I tore off out of there, leaving behind whatever that thing was. I checked my rear view to see if that thing would follow me. Thankfully, it didn't. I was able to get about 5 miles away before my car sputtered to a stop. I was officially out of gas. Thankfully, I was a good distance away that thing probably wouldn't be able to get to me, so I felt some relief. I checked my phone to see if there were any tow truck companies nearby. There were 2, but both of them were closed. I called both and left messages, telling them where I was and what was going on. Either way, it looked like that I was staying the night in my car. I woke up the next morning to tapping on my window, which scared the life out of me. Thankfully, it was what looked like a nice old man wearing an old denim jacket that had the logo of one of the tow truck companies I called. I got out and I told him what was going on. He told me not to worry and that we'd get everything figured out. He got my car onto the truck bed and he told me to hop in his truck, which I did. Before the old man hopped in the truck, he took off his jacket, revealing that he had a prosthetic arm. The old man then hopped in the truck, gave me a smile, and started driving back to the town. I live in northern Canada, in a somewhat small town where not much really happens. The town is surrounded by woods, and other than logging and mining, the town just had your typical industries. I was the town tow truck driver. Basically, I spent most of my time picking up stranded passerbys just driving through, or the occasional tow from the abandoned car at my bar. My job was pretty easy since I was never called to do repos, and I set my own rates. I lived in a small town where everyone knew everyone, so I kept my rates reasonable in order to keep my reputation in high praise. Since the town was small and I was a business owner, mostly everyone had my cell phone number, and vice versa. This was neither a good thing nor bad, since I could call in a favor at any time, but they could do the same with me. I would get more calls than normal in the winter, since the snowfall was pretty intense. One night I'm at the bar, having a good time with the boys. There was a UFC fight on or something, so the bar was packed. I can normally get a decent meal at the bar for cheap, since the bar owner is a good friend of mine, and also my neighbor. It was wintertime, so my days were slightly more busy than usual, but I still only had to do 3 tows a day or so. I remember seeing a good friend of mine, Troy, at the bar. He was the town linesman, someone who worked on the power lines when they go down. He was the town's hero in the wintertime, with the occasional dead tree taking out a power line. Troy was a cool guy, in his late 20s and in very good shape. I'm in my early 40s, so I'm not able to drink as much as I once did. So when Troy offered me a beer and to stay and watch the fight, I had to decline. I ended up driving home before the fight even started, since I was tired and I didn't really care who won. I drove 15 minutes home on the snowy roads. Thankfully, my tow truck was built like a tank, and I hardly even noticed the snow at lower speeds. I get home and check my emails on my phone before going to bed. At 2 in the morning, I get a call from Troy. I normally don't answer the phone at these hours unless I have them saved as a contact. Having known Troy pretty well, I figured it must have been an emergency. I already knew the nature of the call before I answered the phone. He probably needs a tow. "Hey man, sorry to bother you so late." "No, you're good. I was still up," I lied. "Well, driving home I hit something with my truck, and it's totaled. I can't even get it to start." "Oh shoot," I said. "Your nice work truck is totaled? What did you hit?" I asked curiously. "I don't know, it was some kind of deer thing. It ran off." I had seen Troy's work truck before. It was practically brand new and made to handle rough environments. It had a big brush guard on the front which should have destroyed any type of deer with little to no damage to the truck. He might have hit a moose, which is far more heavier. Then again, I don't know how fast he was going, so things could change. "Okay, Troy, just send me a pin on Google Maps and I'll be there." I hop in my truck and get it started. Troy finally sends me a pin and I see that he's clear across town. My arrival time is 25 minutes. I start to drive and I get a call from Troy, except this time he's behaving oddly. He seems jumpy and nervous. "What's up, Troy? I'm on my way." "Hey, there's something outside in the woods. I don't know what it is, but It's growling and it sounds big. I was going to stay in the truck, but the door would not stay closed. I have climbing equipment in the back, so I'm going to go find a tree and stay in there until you get here. Seeing that Troy is clearly scared, I do not tell him that bears are great climbers, but I do tell him that I'll be there in 20 minutes. He seems slightly at ease, but still on edge. He hangs up, but he calls me 5 minutes later. "Hey, I saw it," he says in a hushed tone. "You saw what?" "I saw it. It wasn't a deer. It was something acting like one. It has antlers, but walks like a human." I remembered earlier that evening that Troy was at the bar and probably had one too many, but he sounded sober in all the other phone calls. "What do you mean it walks like a human?" I asked. "It's walking on 2 legs, he says. I have a flashback to when I was a kid. My grandparents would tell me to be aware of the evils that lurked in the woods at night. I always figured that these stories of beasts and demons that haunt the forest were to scare us into obeying our parents and to take care of the woods. I heard a snap of a tree branch on the other line of the phone, and Troy let out a terrifying sigh. "Oh no, it sees me." Troy then hung up the phone. I was going much faster than I should have been on the dark and snowy roads, but I was generally worried for Troy's safety. I tried calling Troy, but he doesn't answer. This makes me more worried. I finally arrive and see his truck in the middle of the desolate road. The lights are on in the truck, but Troy isn't there. I stay in my truck and try calling again, but he doesn't answer. Normally I would just hitch up the truck and take off, but having heard what had happened on the phone, I assume that Troy is still in danger. I venture out of the truck and call his cell again. I can hear a faint ringing of a ringtone coming from up in a tree. I shine my flashlight around the treetops until I spot something red hanging from the tree. I disregard any caution and walk in haste to the bottom of the tree to get a better look. And to my horror, I see what remains of a brutal attack on Troy. His limbs and head were removed. The only thing that remained was his eviscerated torso that was buckled up into the safety harness. The torso was still dripping and swaying ever so slightly. Having seen this unimaginable horror, I immediately run back to my truck and dial 911. I sit in my locked truck for what feels like an eternity, but after an hour, a single police cruiser finally shows up. I shake my head at the lack of response and exit my truck. I show the officer what remained of my friend Troy. The officer is also deeply disturbed about his remains. The officer calls in more backup, and we finally get a decent turnout. 3 other police cruisers, an ambulance, and even a fire truck arrived on scene. The fire truck had to use their ladder to reach and to cut off the safety harness. I tell the officers what had happened, and their eyes get wide. Something about the creature having antlers and walking upright really seemed to cause great fear. I also tell them that he was at the bar earlier that evening, so he might have not been sober, and was probably seeing things. The official report, as well as the local newspaper, calls Troy's death the result of a vicious bear attack. So many things were wrong about this, and I still wonder to this day, what did Troy hit that night on that dark road?
If you ever traveled through the Norwegian countryside, you might have encountered the various antlers hung up in the trees by the road. There are hundreds of these large moose antlers nailed to the massive pine trees that populate the inland wilderness, stretching on for miles. They're usually found hanging from the middle of the trunk where they're in a clear view of the road. Some of them are even brightly colored and sport fun patterns. Upon Googling what they are supposed to represent, you'll be met with Norwegian newspaper articles likely talking about how the antlers are part of the art installation intended to keep drivers focused while on the road, preventing them from dozing off, and all that sort of nonsense. But that's not the real reason they're there. It's not what the locals will tell you anyways. My story begins on the 25th of September this year. For my girlfriend's 19th birthday, I decided that I wanted to spend the weekend with her at the college she recently started at, We hadn't seen each other in over a month, and the long-distance relationship life proved to be surprisingly more lonely than I had initially anticipated. Since most of my close friends had also left town for studying, I was left with a feeling of loneliness that I had never felt before. An empty feeling that accompanied me everywhere I went. Even my boxing training or playing my usual video games seldom amused me anymore. I truly felt like a shell of my former self. That's exactly why I was so excited about the thought of paying my girlfriend a visit. I yearned for social interaction, and a break from my mundane life was just what I needed. My only problem was the distance between us. To get to her, I would have to either buy an expensive two-way plane ticket or drive for 9 hours straight through mountainous terrain on bumpy, dilapidated roads. The latter being a thought I very much didn't relish. I opened up my bank account on my phone and checked my balance. I signed as I realized I had no other choice than to ask my parents' permission to borrow the family car. After what felt like hours of persuasive arguing, they gave me a hesitant go-ahead and my dad reluctantly tossed me the keys. Though initially skeptical, they probably thought getting some fresh air and interacting with people again would overall benefit me. Can't say I disagreed. I went upstairs to my room and excitedly called my girlfriend, informing her of the good news as I began hastily packing my bags. Before hanging up, I told her I would be leaving tomorrow morning and that she could expect to see me around 6 o'clock the following afternoon, should everything go as planned. Saying it out loud filled me with dread. The longest distance I had ever driven before was my grandparents' house across the forge, 2 hours away from my house. This was a 9-hour trip, not counting rest stops and meal breaks along the way. Needless to say, my previous experiences on the road paled in comparison. I jumped in bed and groaned as my head hit the pillow. I had a long day ahead of me. The following morning, I awoke to my phone's alarm clock cheerfully chirping away. After a few minutes of booting up my consciousness, I quickly rose to my feet and got dressed. I ran downstairs, grabbed a few energy bars from the pantry, stuffed them in my pockets, and left the house in a hurry. I had no time to spare. The morning sun had already made the inside of my parents' car scorching hot. I felt as if I was entering a sauna as I sat down in the driver's seat and felt the burning leather of the steering wheel melt into my fingertips. I turned on the ignition and instantly flicked the air conditioning on to its max setting. While the car began cooling off, I opened the GPS and looked for the fastest route possible to my destination. I live close to a small city in Norway called Trondheim. You've undoubtedly never heard of it. The city is located pretty far up north and lies close to the coast. Meanwhile, my girlfriend's new college is located just outside of Oslo, the country's capital. The only thing separating us was more than 500 kilometers of mountains, forests, and rundown highways. What's not to love? The GPS calculated a route that ran straight down the country as cleanly as it could. A long sign escaped my body as I looked at the section of the display that informed me on the trip's estimated time. It read 9 hours and 32 minutes, longer than I had previously anticipated. I adjusted the mirrors, put the car in drive, and started heading down south. The first few hours of the trip flew by faster than expected. When driving, at least at the start of the long trip, the concept of time seemed to differ greatly from what was normally perceived. What felt like mere minutes in the car can quickly become hours in real time. This is especially true if you are driving through the unfathomable beauty of the Norwegian landscape. The sight of vast lush valleys and towering mountains stretching as far as the eye can see quickly makes you lose track of time. Oceans of green and orange were painted across the most serene autumn canvases I had ever laid my eyes upon. It was breathtaking. I had never really traveled much outside Trondheim before, and the beautiful scenery proved to be almost overwhelming. I drove past several small villages and rural communities, each sprawling with life and personality. If you've never been to Norway or any other geologically similar country, it's honestly hard to fully describe the beauty and serenity of driving through the beautiful subalpine landscape. My road trip was nearing its 3-hour mark when I decided I needed a small break to stretch my legs, munch on some energy bars, and get some fresh air. I pulled over at a small highway rest stop by the side of the road. There were a few other cars parked here, along with a small cafe and a large electronics billboard. I exited my car and took a deep breath of the clean mountain air. It felt refreshing. I turned around to take a look at my surroundings when I noticed a blinking yellow light emitting from the billboard. It displayed a large yellow triangle with an exclamation point in the middle, accompanied by a piece of soul-crushing information. Highway E6 is currently undergoing maintenance a couple of kilometers further up the road. The billboard pointed out that any motorists who intended on traveling on it would have to divert their path and take the county road 255 instead. I cursed quietly under my breath. This meant that I would now have to take a massive detour on some sketchy isolated road in the middle of nowhere. Great, I thought. Just what I needed. This would probably extend my trip by at least an hour and a half. I got back in my car and typed in the newly acquired piece of information into my GPS. According to it, I would soon be entering a heavily wooded and secluded stretch of road. The kind of road you kinda don't want to be on when your car begins to break down or act funny. I started my car and left the rest stop behind, continuing along on Highway E6, until I encountered the large roadblock the billboard had warned me about. Next to it stood a large orange sign with an arrow on it. My eyes followed the arrow and saw that it pointed towards an exit ramp on my right. I turned my steering wheel and drove onto County Road 255. The change was immediately noticeable. This new road made the highway seem like a piece of art. If the E6 was a quiet lake on a beautiful summer's day, County Road 255 was a stormy ocean, just waiting to swallow any unfortunate sailor who dared brave its massive waves. The road was full of potholes and cracked, overgrown asphalt. It looked like nobody had traveled down this path for years. Maybe nobody had. After all, I could think of a few reasons as to why anyone would ever come out here. Despite the occasional jolts of my car, I hit a pothole. I kept driving. Massive pine trees now surrounded me on both sides, and the road had become significantly more narrow than it used to be. 30 minutes had passed and I entered this road, and I sat in my car, listening to some old 80s pop song over the radio while chewing on a protein bar. The loud hum of 4 wheels traversing on decade-old asphalt almost began to feel soothing. That's when I saw them. A pair of large brown antlers were nailed to a tree a couple of meters in front of me. I almost didn't register them as I zoomed past. I probably would have chalked it up to my imagination if it weren't for the second pair of antlers on a different tree, just a short distance ahead. I slowed my car to get a better look at them this time. This set of antlers sported a peculiar pattern of black stripes that ran diagonally down the pair. Across the head, my eyes laid upon yet another set of antlers. These ones were colored in a bright blue polka dot pattern. I noticed another pair. These ones were bright red in color. My car came to a full stop as I investigated the strange road markings. More and more of these seemed to come into view, each donning their own unique color and pattern. The forest was full of them. How strange, I thought. Must be part of some local art installation or something, I quietly mumbled under my breath. I sat in my car for a few minutes, looking around at the various pairs of antlers that surrounded me. It was honestly kind of admirable that they managed to even bother with public art in a place like this. I mean, who would be around to appreciate it? I snapped out of my trance and resumed driving, thinking there was no use in delaying my arrival in Oslo any further. As I continued down the seemingly endless road, more and more antlers seemed to emerge from the tree line. As more of them came into view, I began questioning their authenticity. Surely, there couldn't have been this many moose in the whole county. Did they import thousands of antlers just to hang them up in a place where virtually nobody would ever come to see them? The more I thought about it, the more something seemed a bit off. I kept on driving. As I made my way further down the road, I noticed less and less of the colored antlers. Most of the antlers passing me were now just the normal tan or brown that antlers usually came in. Occasionally, some blue or green ones would appear, but the majority of them were now just their natural color. I kept driving. To my utter disbelief, I saw a building rising on the horizon. A bright red Circle K gas station stood in a stark contrast to the dense, murky forest surrounding it. Instinctually, I checked the gas gauge on the car and noticed that I had a little less of 2/4 left of fuel. Though I expected more, this still wasn't a small quantity of gas, and it would take me pretty far. I hesitated for a moment. It couldn't hurt to refill now that the opportunity had arisen. I mean, who knows how long it would be until the next time I get a chance. I certainly wouldn't want to be stranded out here, in the middle of nowhere, delaying my trip any further. The station crept closer and closer until I decided to pull over. Better to be safe than sorry, was the recurring thought in the back of my mind. I pulled up to one of the gas pumps and stepped out of the car. The atmosphere of the forest hit me like a brick wall. There wasn't a single sound to be heard. No birds, no rustling of trees, no wind. It was eerily quiet. This filled me with a sense of unease I don't know why I was capable of feeling. It was like somewhere deep in my mind, some primal instinct kept warning me of something. I nearly got back in my car to keep driving, but reasoning that there was nothing to be afraid of. I told myself that I was just being silly. I shook the feeling as best as I could as I grabbed the gas pump and started filling up the car. After roughly 5 seconds of pumping, a loud metallic buzzing sound emitted from the pump, and I could feel it go slightly limp. It had stopped working. I tried tinkering with it and repeatedly pressing down on the release, but it wouldn't budge. It seemed the pump was simply run out of gas. Strange. I had never encountered this problem before. I didn't even know this could happen to begin with. I placed the pump back on its holster and made my way towards the inside of the gas station to report the problem. Just as I was about to enter, my eyes caught something a short distance to my right. It was a massive pine tree, probably predating the Vikings by the look of it. It looked ancient. The pine had a slightly more gray and worn-out bark than that of other trees, and it towered above anything I had seen in this forest thus far. But that's not what made me stop dead in my tracks. After all, I had seen large trees before. No. What sent chills down my spine was what stared back at me. Up there, situated maybe 3 meters off the ground, sat a large pair of brown antlers. These were different from the rest. On both sides, close to the middle, were 2 painted-on eyes. They were outlined by a dark crimson coloration that seemed to have seeped further down the antlers. The amount of detail in the eyes had me questioning whether or not these were real for a second. I stood and watched as they ominously stared back at me. It felt as if they were going to blink at any moment. I was finally able to divert my gaze and I headed inside the gas station. The inside of the station was a whole other story. I don't know how I didn't notice it from the outside. The store was completely empty. There wasn't as much as a single bag of beef jerky lining the shelves. They have been picked clean by the looks of it. Most of the fluorescent lights that illuminated the store were still on, indicating that the place still had electricity somehow. The floors were a bit dirty, and a nasty mold had started growing on the ceiling by the corner closest to the door. But other than that, the store was in pristine condition. I walked over to the counter hoping to find some answers that would shed light on this particular situation. I found nothing. No signs of life. No convenient newspaper clippings that would transcribe the history of the gas station in exquisite detail. I was left dumbfounded. What had happened here? I fished out my phone from my pocket, only to quickly realize that any attempts at using it were futile. I had no service. Cliché, I know. I raised my phone high into the air as if I would suddenly gain full 5G coverage. Starting to feel creeped out, I quickly turned around to head back to the exit. Immediately after I left the station, the immense feeling of dread returned. This time, it seemed stronger. It was still eerily quiet out, and I felt as if I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I now had goosebumps all over my body. Then, out of nowhere, something broke the silence. A loud snapping of twigs could be heard coming from the forest behind me. To be honest, the sheer magnitude of the snap made it sound more like a tree got snapped in half rather than a couple of twigs. Without looking back, I booked it back to my car and drove out of there as fast as I could, making sure to roll up any windows and locked all the doors. I continued down the road, hoping I would get back to civilization relatively soon. I must have been driving for what felt like an hour. I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. How long was this road supposed to be again? I should be nearing civilization any time now, but I only saw signs that would indicate otherwise. The forest seemed to grow thicker and the trees taller. I pushed my feet down on the accelerator. I didn't care if I was speeding at this point, not like there would be anyone around to enforce traffic laws anyways. I just wanted out of this damned forest at all costs. A heavy overcast now loomed above, which didn't exactly help the situation. The thick clouds prevented sunlight from shining down, and the woods fell unusually dark for it only being 4 o'clock in the afternoon. As I drove, I saw more antlers stuck to the trees lining the road. Each one looked more ominous than the last. I could have sworn a few of them even had a dark and thick vicious liquid dripping from them. I kept driving, pressing my foot harder on the accelerator. I looked down at my phone to see if I had gotten any signal. Still nothing. I swear I only took my eyes off the road for a second, but that's all it would take for me to nearly hit whatever now laid in the middle of the road. My car came to a screeching halt as I stomped my foot down on the brakes as hard as I could, nearly swerving off the road in the process. The car's headlights illuminated a large furry mass that laid strewn across the road, blocking it in its entirety. It took me a second to realize what I was looking at. Dozens of dead, decaying animals formed a roadblock that looked like it had come straight out of hell. I couldn't tell how many animals were there. Maybe 10, 15, 30? The mass consisted mostly of deer and moose carcasses, but I am pretty sure I saw a few sheep, a cow, and maybe even a horse in there as well. I did what any normal person would have done in my situation. I began freaking out. As if everything that had happened earlier wasn't creepy enough, I now had to deal with the sight of several rotting animal corpses. Even worse, there was nothing I could do. The road was completely blocked. Attempting to drive past it on either side would likely result in my car getting stuck in some ditch, worsening the situation by tenfold. Once I had collected most of my nerves, I sat pondering upon what the next course of action would be. Obviously, there was no way in hell I wanted to step out of the car. I had seen enough horror movies to know what happens to people in these kinds of situations. I thought about driving back the way I came, yet again passing the gas station, and continuing until I reached the highway I had initially driven on. Somehow finding an alternate route to Oslo that didn't involve me getting killed by some depraved serial killer or forced monster. That thought quickly faded as I realized I wouldn't have enough fuel for the trip. I looked at the gas gauge and saw that I had less than a quarter left of juice. This was bad. I could have sworn I had more. I wouldn't be able to make the trip back, and getting stuck out here in the dark seemed to be the worst case scenario. Even if I got past this roadblock, I still wasn't sure if I would have enough gas to reach civilization beyond it. Eventually, I realized I had to take action. In here, I was a sitting duck to whoever or whatever was out there, if there even was something out there. To ease up the situation, I realized that this might just all be a big creepy coincidence. Apart from what sounded like a large tree snapping in half back at the gas station, I really hadn't seen any indication of life. Sinister in nature or not, I hadn't even heard the song of birds. Perhaps the forest really was abandoned. Yeah, that was probably it. I'm just being overly paranoid. The result of listening to too many scary campfire stories as a kid. I scanned the pile of mutilated animal corpses and noticed that I might actually be able to move a few of them out of the way, just barely enough to squeeze through with my car. The right side of the blockade seemed to be comprised of smaller animals, and I had decided that if I just moved a few of them out of the way, it would be enough for me to hightail it out of there. I reluctantly opened my car door and stepped outside, immediately regretting my decision. The smell. Oh God, the smell. I don't know what I expected, but the smell of dozens of rotting animal corpses didn't exactly go easy on the nose. The stench of decay made every fiber in my being want to puke. I tried suppressing my violent bowel movements as best as I could. I took a deep couple of breaths and made my way towards the pile. Halfway to the pile, I jumped as I heard the recognizable sound of wood snapping in the distance, the same sound I'd heard back at the station. I kept walking. Unsurprisingly, the closer I got to the pile, the worse the smell got. Despite this, I pushed through as I grabbed the hind legs of a deer and began dragging it out of the way. Another large snap sounded, this time way closer. I paid no attention to it and tugged at the decaying deer carcass. These things were much heavier than they looked. I managed to drag it off the road as just another loud sound could be heard, this time even closer. I recognized the distinct sound of a tree cracking, and I saw a tall pine tree fall out of the tree line and land on the road I came from, a small distance behind my car. Whatever was responsible was closing in. My heart sank at the thought. I was suddenly filled with a sense of urgency as I grabbed another set of animal legs and desperately began tugging. A new set of twigs snapped, this time alarmingly close. I looked back at the dense woodland next to my car and saw the dark, shadowy silhouette of something big moving throughout the underbrush. I could feel the panic start to set in. Through the sheer adrenaline-infused strength, I launched the deer off the road. Just as I was about to turn around and head back to my car, I heard the sound of heavy hoof footprints behind me. I could feel the ground shake a little with each step. By the clacking of the sound, I could tell that whatever they had belonged to now had made its way onto the asphalt. I stood frozen in fear. A large exhale slithered out of the thing behind me. The sound reminded me of a snorting horse, only more guttural and distorted. The heat of the thing's breath had reached the back of my neck, and I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs. My heart began beating so fast that I thought it was going to burst out of my chest cavity at any moment. I finally mustered up the courage to turn around, and my eyes were laid upon the most gruesome monstrosity I had ever seen. Have you ever had a nightmare or an experience so terrifying that you weren't even able to scream? Have you ever encountered an immense feeling of horror so dreadful that it overwhelmed your entire body? That's exactly how I felt as I turned around to look at this creature that now stood between me and my ticket out of here. Partially illuminated by the headlights of the car, I could only describe the beast's shape as vaguely moose-like in appearance, putting heavy emphasis on the word vaguely. It was large, very large, at least double of the height of my car. Along with 4 hoofed limbs, 2 large hairy appendages protruded from each side of the creature's torso, reaching down to the ground. They almost resembled the legs of a spider. Along its back were large ridges of spine that seemed to be popping out through the monster's thick hide. But that wasn't even the worst part of this abomination's appearance. It was the creature's head that really hammered down the feeling of being in the presence of an eldritch monstrosity. A large set of antlers dominated its upper skull, except that they weren't really antlers. They looked more like a set of massive bony human hands altered to mimic the antlers of a moose. Some of the gaunt fingers were even freakishly elongated to further set the look. The creature had no eyes, no real ones anyways. Instead, 2 large oval markings seemed to be painted onto its antlers. It reminded me of those fake-eye cobras and certain insects that have that used to intimidate would-be predators. Lastly, the creature's lower jaw consisted of 2 long deer-like mandibles that were equipped with several rows of long spindly serrated teeth. Before I had a chance to react, the bestial figure screeched and began rapidly crawling towards me. When I say crawling, I mean it. Each of its 6 limbs bent down at awkward angles and began unnaturally scurrying my way. It was fast. I could hear the snapping of bones coming from the creature as it moved. Each appendage seemed to have a will of its own, dragging the rest of the monster with it. It looked unnaturally contorted. In an act of pure desperation, I ducked into the pile of rotting animals behind me and buried myself deep in the decomposing flesh, hoping that the creature would eventually lose track of me and give up. In retrospect, it probably wasn't the brightest idea, but I figured I stood no chance of outrunning it, especially not in the dense woodland. Whatever this thing was, it would be perfectly adapted to pursuit through the dense underbrush, something I was not. My sanctuary didn't last for long, as I saw one of its spider-like appendages strike down in the flesh right next to me. I could hear the guttural vocalizations escape its mouth as it began frantically searching for me. It sounded horrible. I was on the verge of tears by this point. There was no way I was going to get out of this situation alive. I felt truly doomed. Another appendage struck down beside me. It was going to find me eventually, and the situation seemed hopeless. I watched in horror as the deer carcasses I had been hiding under got effortlessly tossed aside by the creature. I could see it even more in detail now. Its dark, thick hide looked cracked and worn down, a texture very reminiscent of tree bark. It had noticed me. The beast tilted its head downwards, and I could feel the artificial eyes on the antlers stare into my soul. An ear-piercing screech left its body as it raised one of its appendages and wrapped it around my foot. I noticed that at the end of the spider-like leg came attached with a pair of sharp opposable claws. The claw dug into my leg, and I let out a scream of excruciating pain. This was how I was going to die. The creature opened its mouth, and I was presented with rows upon rows of sharp yellow teeth. In the last desperate attempt at survival, I kicked the creature's 2 mandibles as hard as I could with my other leg. It visibly recoiled in pain. I kicked it again, even harder this time. I could feel it loosen its grip on my foot, and I rolled over and got back on my feet. Limping towards the car, I swung open the driver's side door and got in just in time for the creature to slam its entire body weight against the vehicle. It wasn't giving up without a fight. I slammed down on the accelerator with my foot and sped through the opening in the roadblock I had previously cleared. I could feel the ground shake behind me as I looked into the rearview mirror and saw the massive beast in hot pursuit. I was going well over 100 kilometers an hour by now, but my assaultant only seemed to get closer and closer. This should have been impossible. How was it moving so fast? I sped up even more. I could hear the roar of the engine, as it probably produced the fastest moving car in Europe at this point. I prayed to every god imaginable as I looked to my left and saw the galloping creature had caught up to the car and was now running beside it. It turned towards me, and I could have sworn I saw a sickly and contorted smile begin to form upon its mouth. I started cursing, contemplating just to crash the car into a tree so that my death would at least be swift and relatively painless. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the inevitable attack. Seconds, maybe even minutes had gone by before I realized it never came. I was completely fine, still driving along the road. I looked back in the rearview mirror and saw that the creature had stopped in the middle of its tracks. It was just standing there as if suddenly deciding I wasn't worth the effort. I also noticed the strange antlers on the trees on both sides of the road. These antlers were similar to the other ones, except these ones were large and inscribed with these weird symbols and markings. Due to the distance between us, I couldn't make out what the antlers said or depicted. The two parallel antlers almost reminded me of some sort of gate, as if it marked the border between the creature's territory and our world. Past the antlers towards my direction, the surrounding trees seemed completely normal. I was no longer surrounded by antlers, and the forest even seemed more inviting. The grotesque monster let out a bellowing roar, and I watched as it turned around and disappeared into the gloomy woodland. After a short while of driving, I was met with a big blue sign that pointed me towards Highway E6. I was relieved beyond comprehension. Eventually, the surrounding force seemed to ease up, and after a few minutes of following the sign, I was reunited with the scenic valleys and landscapes that I had previously ventured on. I steered onto Highway E6 and rode it until I arrived at a small but not busy gas station in a small rural community. As I parked my car, I broke down in tears and tried to make sense of what the hell just happened. I guess my adrenaline must have worn out, because the last thing I remembered before waking up was slamming my head down on the steering wheel and passing out. I woke up a couple of hours later to tapping on my window. 2 police officers were called in when the customers at the gas station had noticed a lifeless man covered in blood sitting alone in his car. They must have thought that I was dead or something, not that I blame them. I really looked like a zombie. My clothes were all torn and bloodied from the ordeal with the dead animal pile. I got out of my vehicle and tried explaining my situation. They brought me back to the local police station for a psychic and mental evaluation. When I gave them a statement, I described everything that had happened to me in perfect detail and tried to sound as sane as possible while doing it. At first, I could tell that they didn't believe me. I mean, who would? It was only after I gave them the location of where I had encountered the creature that they began tensing up. A heavy silence fell upon the interrogation room, and the 2 officers nervously exchanged looks. It was as if they knew something I didn't. I asked them about the County Road 255 and the abandoned gas station, but they were quick to shut down any questions I had. The official police report stated that I had been in a state of shock from a local bear attack when the 2 officers found me. That's how they explained what had caused the wound on my leg and why I had massive scratch marks all over my car. It was ridiculous. Everyone and their mother knows there hadn't been a report of a bear sighting in this area for over 100 years. When they eventually released me, I called up my girlfriend to let her know that I wasn't going to be arriving until tomorrow afternoon. I checked into a nearby motel and asked the receptionist if he knew anything about the County Road 255 or the strange antlers that lined the road. The receptionist was an old man in his early 60s, who looked like the sort of guy who would know a thing or two about the town's history. He fell silent. I asked again, and I could see that my question made him visibly uncomfortable. After a while of debating whether or not he should open his mouth, he reluctantly told me that people, especially outsiders, weren't supposed to go there. When I asked him why, he quietly mumbled to me under his breath, as if not wanting to be heard by others, that people who venture into the surrounding woods never come back out. Apparently, this had been going on for decades, but had somehow never been picked up by any local or national news outlets. When I asked him why they didn't just close down the road, he told me that the town tried to do it back in the late 80s, but that it just led to the disappearances happening closer and closer to town. As a result, they kept the road open as if to please whatever the hell that entity was that called the forest home. I tried further prying on the subject, but he refused to elaborate. After a while, I thanked him and went up to my room. I don't know what to make of all this. People in this town seem to know something about the forest that they aren't telling me. The police don't even want to go out there to investigate whether or not my claims hold any truth. There was something off about this entire thing. For the past few hours, I have been sitting in my motel room, transcribing my experience as best as I could while this memory is still fresh in my mind. Let my story serve as a cautionary tale. If you ever plan on traveling through the Norwegian countryside and happen to see antlers hanging from the trees by the road, beware. Something else might be lurking nearby.
Operation Wendigo. Operation Wendigo was enacted in 2013 by the FBI due to the National Park Ranger Service reporting the highest cases of missing and/or attacked campers by creatures in the woods. Normally, the FBI gets reports of incidents in the national parks when something of significance happened, like the National Park Skinwalker incident, which was recently declassified. The names of the cases do not necessarily reflect actual events in the case, but rather what has been reported to us by the park rangers, most of which are dramatically created, mainly to show the level of severity of the case. Anyways, sorry for the preface. My name is Agent Johnson, and I was assigned to Operation Wendigo with my partner, Agent Borsky, back in November. Agent Borsky is rather new to the Bureau and hasn't been hardened by the cruel nature of the job. Borsky is a religious man, I believe, which is perfectly fine, yet I have found that to become an issue in the past with other cases. We are not the first agents on this case. They didn't tell us how many sets of agents they had before, but we are able to look at the case file to see all the previous notes and logs. Most of the time looking at case notes, there is a slight disconnect between each different sets of agents, as you would suspect, since not everyone looks at things the same way. Agent Borsky and I are driving to the national park early one November morning, and he's reviewing the case notes aloud while I'm driving. It appears that in July of 2013, there have been 12 missing persons and 37 reports of animal attacks in just this park alone. That's essentially an attack a day. That level of attacks is extremely strange, but it gets weirder. Some of the reports of the creature, not animal, was that it was bipedal and it had claws. All of the attacks were at night, so the victims were not able to get a better description than that. It didn't give us much to work off of, but Borsky and I were able to make assumptions on the case. I do not believe in the paranormal, nor am I religious. I believe that everything has a scientific or at least a logical explanation. My guess, based on my experience, was that this was either a cult or a human trafficking ring hiding in the park and covering up the abductions as people going missing in the park. Borsky nodded at my assumption, but I could tell that there was something in his mind suggesting that there was more to this case than what science could explain. You know, every year we do find an animal that we had no idea existed, Borsky said. They're mainly smaller species, but every now and then we do find a large one. I glanced over to Borsky, taking my attention off the road for a brief moment to give him a skeptical look. Do you think that there's an unknown animal attacking these campers that we don't know about? I said with extreme skepticism. My question brought Borsky back to reality, but not all the way. Well, you never know, he said. He continued reading the case file, although silently, and would every now and then share something interesting. Ooh, look at this. There's been reports of ghost sightings as well, he said with excitement. My eyes practically rolled out of my head. Ghost sightings? Really? Every place is haunted depending on who you ask, I said with a smile. Borsky continued reading silently the entire way to the park, and we met up with some of the park rangers. We pulled into the ranger station, and we were greeted by 2 rangers. It was late in the afternoon, so we had a good couple of hours before we called it a day. We asked to be filled in on what they knew about the situation. Unfortunately, they knew very little, since the park rangers were instructed not to talk about anything that happened in the park. I glanced at the rangers and noticed that their uniforms were typical, but that they were carrying rifles. Whoa boys, quite the firepower you got there, I said. Well, this is bear country, and I am sure you're aware of our missing persons numbers as of late, they responded. They walked us inside of the ranger station, and we met with all the other rangers. They were also equally useless to us in terms of information, since no one really had an idea what was going on. We were then informed that there had been an attack that morning, and that we were able to join them in their investigation, if we wished. We joined them and rode down to the campsite in one of the rangers' jeeps. We arrived at the site, but everything else had been roped off. The site had 2 small camping trailers parked next to each other. One of the trailers had been knocked over, and both had large claw marks on the doors and sides. "What happened here?" said Borsky. "Well, it looks like we had another bear attack last night. These people probably left some food out, and the bears did the rest," said the ranger. I was amazed at this damage. Bears will attack people, but they will avoid it if it is possible. The bears probably figured that there was food inside, but I've never seen a bear so persistent enough to knock over a camping trailer to do so. "Are there any survivors?" I asked. I was met with a solemn headshake. "How many do we figure were camping here?" I asked. "Looks like 10 campers," responded the ranger. 10 campers? There's no way a bear, or even a couple of bears, would eat 10 campers in one attack. Our options are that there's either something menacing in these woods, or that this was a cover-up. I was beginning to be envious of the rangers and their additional firepower. I wasn't getting spooked, but something about this and what I was looking at was making me uneasy. We walked up to the campsite to see that most of the bodies were either taken by the alleged bears, or that the paramedics had already gotten them. There wasn't much for us to see other than the blood and claw marks. The blood was everywhere. I had been on many cases where there were fatalities and even where I killed some people, but none of that compares to what I was looking at. There were parts of the trailer that had been so bloodied that it began to pool in small puddles. We checked the locks on the door, which indeed were locked, but it appeared that the door frame of the trailer gave in, allowing whatever intruder to enter. National parks do not allow guns of any kind, so these campers were literally fish in a barrel with nowhere to go. I was beginning to doubt my trafficker's theory due to the carnage that laid before me. Typically, traffickers want to traffic people that aren't harmed, or at least not dead. Whatever had happened here didn't seem to care whether or not people had died. We left the crime scene after conducting a small investigation, which only resulted in us documenting the claw marks on the trailer. The trailer was made of a somewhat thin sheet metal, but even then, I'm unaware of any kind of bear that can do that. Perhaps I don't know enough about bears. We rode back to the station with some of the rangers, and I was glancing around the park, admiring the beauty. I was trying to take my mind off of what I'd just seen, and this was doing the trick. The park nestled up to this beautiful mountain that had snow on top of it. It was November and it was chilly out, but snow had yet to fall. As I was admiring the landscape, something caught my eye. It was the color yellow that popped out from the lush green forest. I focused on the color to see what appeared to be a small child wearing something yellow off in the distance. It caught my attention, but I thought nothing of it. We made it back to the ranger station, and the sun had a good ways to go before setting. However, the rangers were already closing up the station. "Wait, why are you guys closing up? Aren't you guys supposed to be open at all hours?" I was then informed, due to recent events of the campers being attacked at night, that they have set a curfew for both rangers and campers that no one was allowed outside after dark. We were given the option to stay at the station, stay in town, or there was a fire tower a few miles in the forest that wasn't occupied by anyone during this time of year. Borsky and I looked at each other, and we both nodded. "We'll take the fire tower," I said. Borsky and I, both being of a detective mindset, knew that since no one would be at the fire tower, that we could investigate at night without interruption. That would be the only way to really get answers. The rangers escorted us out to the fire tower, and to my surprise, the fire tower was quite large. It reached over the tops of the trees. They dropped us off and we hiked up the stairs. The stairs had an interesting feature that you could retract the first 15 steps, much like the ladder on one's attic. The inside of the fire station was quite impressive, having not been used in a few months. There were 3 beds, a small stove, and a table with a few chairs around it. We didn't have much stuff other than our packs and our case notes. Granted, being an FBI field agent, we were already carrying our equipment that we needed to investigate. Once we put our stuff down, we climbed back down the stairs and started walking in a random direction that hopefully would lead us to a campsite. Our walk would prove pointless, as most of the campsites were empty. We didn't know if this was because of the off-season, or if that campers knew what was happening. We walked a good mile or so, and we eventually found an old-looking trailer parked at one of the campsites. As we walked over to the trailer, I saw a yellow flash again. I looked over and saw the small girl standing about 50 yards away. She was just standing there, looking at us. I waved to the little girl, and me and Borsky walked over to the trailer. The trailer was old, and the tires that supported it were flat. Not a good sign. We knocked on the trailer, and we didn't get a response. Granted, it was getting dark, and there was a really good possibility that this trailer was abandoned. We left the trailer and went back to where we saw the girl, but she was gone. Our options were either to continue down this now darkening trail to find the girl, or head back to the fire tower. I glanced at my watch to see that it was about 7:30 p.m., but the trees were already blocking much of what was left of daylight. We decided to head back and come back tomorrow with some of the rangers. We hiked back, and by this time, it was pitch dark out. The sun had completely set, and the trees seemed to add a layer of thick darkness that would swallow the light of our flashlights. It was probably a good idea that we turned around when we did. We went up the stairs to the fire station, and we retracted the first 15 steps, much like the attic stairs I had mentioned earlier. We obviously did this to prevent any unwelcome guests from coming up the stairs while we slept. To be completely honest, having seen the campsite earlier, it actually bothered me to where I'd actually feared for the first time in the field in a long time. We reached the top of the fire station, and due to our brief yet tiresome hike, we fell asleep rather quickly. I dreamt that night of something rather horrific. I dreamt that I was in the woods alone, walking down the path that we saw the small child on. I could feel eyes all around me, and a strong presence of evil. I continued down the path until I came across something hunched over in the middle of the trail. I didn't have a flashlight, but I could still see in the dark to a degree. The thing hunched down seemed to be eating something. I could hear the crunching and tearing of bone and tissue. My legs didn't move, but I could feel myself getting closer. The creature from behind looked very similar to a human, if it wasn't for the antlers on its head. Its back was pale, its muscles looked dried and withered, as if you left meat in the freezer for too long. I was now close enough to see that the creature was eating Agent Borsky. Borsky was still alive and thrashing around in pain, although the creature easily kept him down with one hand. My fear overcame me, and rather than helping Borsky, I tried to run, but I couldn't. I think this notified the creature, and it stopped eating Borsky to look at me. The creature's face was completely human, although its ears, lips, and nose had withered off its body and were no longer there. It bore yellowish fangs, and its eyes were blood red. Its claws were large and rugged, unlike that of a bear or a tiger. I could now understand the damage of the two trailers from earlier. The creature stood up and swiped at my throat, but before it could land its killing blow, I woke up inside of the fire station. When I woke, I was covered in sweat. I was completely terrified. I glanced over to Borsky, and he was asleep. Something outside caught my eye, and I could see outside the window that there was something just outside of our door. I grabbed my gun and my flashlight, shined my light outside to see a familiar flash of yellow. I went to the door and opened it, and saw the girl in yellow now starting to go down the stairs. How was this possible? How did she get up the stairs since we removed the first couple of steps? I was baffled. I tried talking to her, but she just kept moving. I shouted to Borsky and told him that he needed to wake up and follow me. He groaned and began to get up, and I followed the girl down the steps. I couldn't ever get a good look at her. Whenever I would shine my light directly at her, she would completely disappear, only to appear a few more feet ahead of where she once stood. I knew that something about this was unlike any experience I had ever had, and that I had no explanation on what was going on. Borsky finally caught up to me, and I told him that I think that this girl we're following is a ghost. I couldn't see his face, but I knew that his eyes were wide, and that he believed me. She then led us down the dark trail. Even though it was dark and we didn't know where we were going, I felt comforted, as if I was being led by someone I could trust, and that I was in good hands. She ended up leading us a good distance away, down an old path that didn't look used anymore. The path was barely noticeable, even having a guide to show us where it was. The trail was completely overgrown. Borsky and I had to push through in order to follow the girl. We walked what I would guess to be 5 miles down this path, but it was probably more like 2. The weeds and brush made it very difficult to get anywhere, and we had no idea how we were going to get back. The girl finally stopped and pointed at what appeared to be a very old cabin. The girl would no longer disappear when I shined my light at her, and I noticed that her dress to be very out of date. She looked as if she was once a pioneer of some kind. Her skin was pale and her eyes were dark. Although I knew I was looking at a ghost, I wasn't afraid. She never said anything, but just pointed at the cabin. Borsky and I knew that asking her questions would be pointless, and that whatever questions we had would be answered by entering the cabin. We shined our lights on the cabin and saw that it was not of this time. We looked back at the girl to see that she had disappeared. We pressed on the cabin door, which gave us much resistance, but eventually squeaked open. Inside we could see what appeared to be a family cabin. There were still plates on the table and an old makeshift furniture placed around the room. I saw an old musket that must have been the late 1800s. As I was admiring the rifle, I noticed an engraving on the butt of the gun. Jeremiah, it said. Borsky called me over and shined his light to a place on the floor next to the fireplace. The floor was stained with a dark reddish brown, and it was next to a yellow dress, much like the one we saw on the girl. After a quick investigation, inside the fireplace we were able to find small but human bones. What happened here? Borsky said. I paused and used my detective mind while putting together what I knew about some of the pioneers. I have heard of pioneers getting snowed in or not having enough food back in those days, and were forced to make a difficult decision to survive. Borsky, I think someone ate this girl. We checked the plates on the table, and unfortunately it did confirm my theory. The bones on the plates were small human bones. As we came to this conclusion, we heard a sound outside. It sounded as if something large was pushing itself through the overgrown brush with great speed, as if we found something that someone did not want us to see. We quickly ran to the door and locked it with the old locks, yet still working. The cabin did have old and somewhat opaque windows, yet we could still see shapes through it. The door began to shake violently, which shook the entire cabin. A creature then broke a window and tried to enter through it, but it was too large to fit. We could now see that the creature resembled that thing I saw in my dreams. It was tall, and it looked withered and pale. Its head had antlers, and its face lacked features. Borsky and I opened fire on the creature, which appeared to harm the creature, causing it to panic. While trying to enter the window, one of its antlers got stuck inside the window. The creature tried frantically to remove its large head from the window, but it was stuck. Borsky and I fired most of our ammo, but I told him to wait. Seeing now that this creature couldn't move, I walked over to it. I picked up the old rifle and pointed to the name on it, saying, "Jeremiah?" The creature looked at me with knowing eyes. It clearly recognized the name. "What did you do?" I said to the creature. The creature's panic had stopped, and it sat there as if it was in shame. It let out a growl, and a low, gravelly voice said, "We were hungry." I then lifted my pistol and shot the creature in the eye. The back of its head came off, and a thick, dark liquid splattered the inside of the cabin. The creature then spasmed before laying lifeless in the window. Whatever this thing was, it was clearly dead. I took the bones from inside, as well as the yellow dress, and dug a small grave with an old shovel I found inside. I placed the bones on the dress inside and covered the small grave with dirt. Borsky and I left the creature in the window and made our way back to the ranger station. At this time the sun was beginning to rise. We could hear the birds chirping, and we felt a sense of dread lift from the forest. We finally made it back to the station, and we were greeted by some of the rangers. We told them rather confidently that we had single-handedly solved the missing persons problem. They looked at us confused, and we all hopped into the jeep. We showed them the hidden trail that led to the cabin, but to our horror and dismay, The creature that we had recently killed was no longer in the window. It was missing. It was right there, guys. I'm telling you. It had these big antlers and claws. The rangers nodded their head as if they'd seen this before. In fact, they didn't even seem remotely surprised. We know, fellows. Apparently legend has it, if you eat another human, you turn into those things. I then recalled what the creature said to me before I killed it. We were hungry. We. More than one. Borsky, how many plates are on the table? He went inside and quickly confirmed what I had feared. There's 5 plates. It wasn't just Jeremiah that ate this girl. It was a whole family. There are more of these things out there. I am a 23-year-old girl with quite the story to share. This happened when I was 15, and there will never be a day that goes by that I don't think about what had happened. First off, I am deaf. I can still hear some sounds, but they're extremely low and they're always muffled. I know ASL, American Sign Language, and I can talk although my words don't always come out sounding normal. I'm self-conscious about this, so I only speak to my family. Everyone else I mouth and sign when I communicate. At the time of this story, I didn't have a lot of friends. My father, who was an accountant for the mob, saw how poorly the books were being handled and saw that there were millions to be taken, that he could file away his taxes. He got away with it for years, until one year, the mob boss's wife, who was actually an accountant that didn't want part of the family business, took a look at the books. My father caught wind of this and immediately turned to the FBI for protection. He became an informant, and in return for his information, they placed my family in witness protection. They placed us out in Kansas, far away from the city, and had us take the identity as corn farmers. My mother was pretty disgusted by this. She's what country people call a city slicker. My mother grew up middle class and always had what she needed. She never had to see where the goods were farmed and made. My father was just glad to have protection, but he was still paranoid about the mob. He was always prepared to pack up and leave at any sight of trouble. His paranoia led him placing high-quality cameras and a security system all around our home. We were all given these special necklaces, much like the ones you see in Life Alert commercials, that had a button to alert the security company. Rather than just having an alarm go off to alert my family, the security company also installed these very bright flashing lights in order to get my attention. Our home was literally next to this large cornfield out in the middle of nowhere. We wouldn't actually farm the corn, we just owned a lot and had farmers nearby drive their harvesters over to collect the corn. During the off-season, the same farmers would come and plant their seeds. The farmers offered to pay us for letting them use our lot, but my father always declined in hopes to have the farmers like us. So if the mob ever came through town asking for us, that they would have our backs. Now I've told you the backstory. Here's what happened. We had lived in the country for 3 years now. I had completely forgotten about my life back in the city. So when I saw a dark tinted car parked across the street when I got off my school bus, I didn't pay it much mind. I figured it was someone that just got lost in the area, which occasionally happens. We live not too far from the highway, and if you get gas at the local gas station, it makes you drive on our road to get back to the main road that leads you to the highway. I go inside and lock the door behind me. My parents took new jobs recently since moving here, and it just so happened that both of them would be out of town this weekend. I finished up my homework for the weekend, which took about an hour, and went outside and jumped on the trampoline before it got too dark. The trampoline was next to the cornfield, which for some reason always made me uneasy. I was jumping on the trampoline when something most unusual happened. I felt this intense feeling of dread coming from the cornfield. The corn at this time was tall, thus I couldn't see who it was out there. Being somewhat spooked, I decided that this was enough time outside next to the creepy cornfield. I went inside just before dark and made myself a pizza. I set a timer on my phone with a vibrating alert, so I would know when the pizza was ready. For whatever reason, I happened to glance outside to see the car still parked. They probably broke down, I thought. My phone went off and I got my pizza out of the oven. I was in my room on my computer when something happened that never happened before. The lights to the security system went off. This startled me and I hid under my bed. My phone then began to blow up with texts from both parents. They had this app on their phone that would allow them access to cameras in my home. One of the texts from my father said, "Lisa, there's a man in the house. He is armed. I'm gonna need you to climb out your window and go hide in the cornfield while I call the police." This text hit my stomach with the highest intensity of anxiety I'd ever felt. My room was on the first floor, which was good and bad. Good that I didn't need to jump from a high height, but bad since it would be one of the first rooms the man will look in. I quickly grabbed my phone and exited my room through the window. I had no idea if I was being quiet. In my rush to leave my room, I probably alerted the man of my location, because right before I entered the cornfield, I looked back to see a man climbing out of my window after me. I disregarded my previous fears of the cornfield and bolted inside. The field was huge, and I ran quickly and sporadically in random directions in order to better hide. When I got a good distance to where I felt properly hidden, I laid on my stomach on the ground. I could see a flashlight in the distance combing the field. The light could barely be seen through all the corn, but I could tell that the light was getting closer. At this moment I knew that I would eventually be found, but out of nowhere I was beginning to smell this awful smell. I can't really describe it, but it was enough to distract me from my impending doom. I glanced up to see the light moving frantically, as if something was happening to the man. As I watched, the light fell. I lay there for 30 minutes until my father texted me that the police were at my home and that they were looking for me. I got up slowly and started walking in the direction of the fallen light. The closer I got, the more I could see blood splattered in the area. The corn in this area was greatly compressed, and it looked like someone was dragged off. The amount of blood was significant. Whoever's blood it was probably dead. I didn't see a body though. Either the person made it out, or something dragged it off into the night. I made my way through the cornfield and back to my house. I could see the police cruisers out in my driveway, as well as the farmer that was supposed to check in on me. I walked into my home and surprised the police and the farmer. They had no idea where I was and figured the worst. I tried to tell them what had happened, but they couldn't understand me. I was panicking and I was probably sounding crazy. I was also signing while I was talking to the farmer. Then he remembered that I was deaf. He grabbed me a piece of paper and I wrote that the man came for me in the cornfield, but something took him away. I think the man died since there was a lot of blood. The police and the farmer were startled by this. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could tell that the police wanted to go outside to the cornfield to investigate, but the farmer stopped them. I could only read a portion of what his mouth was saying, but he said that the cornfields were not safe at night. I went home with the farmer, and my parents came home the next day. The police were out in the cornfield investigating, and I could see them bring out parts of a body of what I assumed to be the intruder. My father eventually told me the reason he told me to go into the cornfield. It was because that the locals believed that there was a Skinwalker that lived there at night. Apparently, they draw you in by calling your name or mimicking voices of your loved ones. He gambled on the fact that, since I was deaf, that I would ignore these voices, and whoever followed me into the cornfield would be attacked, rather than me. This obviously disturbed me because that was probably something very close to me that night, since I could smell it. It was probably trying to lure me away, but saw my intruder and attacked him instead. It bothers me even more that the thing probably was trying to talk to me. We obviously moved from that home because it turned out the intruder was sent by the mob to kill us, but I also like to think it had something to do with what lived in that cornfield. This is a difficult story for me to tell you, but I think it's important for you to be informed. There is something in the mountains in Montana. I don't know what it is, but I know it's deadly. My story starts back in the early 80s. My father had recently lost his job. My father then moved our family out to Montana in hopes for a new beginning. The land price was incredibly cheap, which allowed my father to buy a couple hundred acres of land. The land that he purchased seemed untouched, as if we were the only humans to ever see this part of land. My family initially did not have enough money to build a house, so we stayed in a trailer on the property. The conditions weren't terrible, except it was difficult for me and my family, considering my older brother Brian had special needs. Brian had a hard time speaking, which made it very difficult to understand what he needed. He would also sleepwalk every night. His sleepwalking was very bad. There were times that we'd often find him the next morning, a couple of miles away. Over the years, my family has concluded the best way to keep track of Brian was to make sure that he wore an anklet to bed that had bells on it, and to keep all the doors and windows locked. Now you can kind of understand the difficulty of staying in a trailer with someone with this condition. Needless to say, my family was pretty anxious to start building a house on the property. Brian, for the most part, was a great brother. He was completely harmless and loved to laugh. He loved animals, especially the wildlife, and he'd get very excited when he saw an animal outside. Things seemed to change when we moved to Montana. It seemed that Brian no longer wanted to go outside, and he definitely didn't want to go near the woods. During the day, Brian seemed to be fine for the most part, but at night, he seemed to get very agitated and would point off into the woods, saying something that we couldn't understand. We would check with a flashlight, and of course, never saw anything, but Brian would still feel disturbed. The woods didn't really bother me. I knew for the most part what kind of animals were out there, so I wasn't too scared. However, on some nights, I did feel this weird feeling of something dreadful out in the woods, just barely out of my vision. Whenever Brian was having one of his episodes is when I felt that dreadful feeling coming from the woods. It was almost as if Brian could sense it too. Things were like this for a couple of weeks, but everything changed one day when I took Brian out into the woods to go hiking. Brian and I had been cooped up inside that trailer for some time. Brian and I had hiked a solid hour into the woods. The land was quite beautiful. During the first part of our hike, it was as if I had the old Brian back. He didn't seem to be spooked about the woods at all. During our hike, we found a couple streams and rivers, and Brian was able to see a couple deer. Instead of going back, we decided to keep going deeper and deeper into the woods. This was a huge mistake. The deeper we went, the more I noticed these weird scratches on these trees. Normally, I would think that this would be deer rubbing antlers on trees, but this was different. There were only 3 marks, as if something with talons were scratching the trees. The marks looked deep. Just when we were about to turn back, Brian started pointing at something. I looked at what Brian was pointing at, and to my surprise, there was a huge cave that led into the hillside. "Hey, good find, Brian," I told him, but Brian seemed upset. Instead of wanting to investigate, Brian wanted nothing to do with the cave. Brian started to get agitated, and I had to calm him down. I started to feel that dreadful feeling coming from the cave. At this point, Brian and I decided to head back, but right before we left, I could have sworn I saw something inside the cave move. I couldn't exactly be sure, but it looked like a set of red eyes looking at me. Instead of sprinting off into the woods, leaving Brian behind, I decided to play a game with him, and I told him, "Hey Brian, first one back to the trailer wins." We both ran back to the trailer in record time. Thankfully, I don't think Brian knew what I saw. While we were running, however, I would glance back every now and then, just to make sure that we weren't being followed. There were a couple of times where I thought I saw something, but I couldn't be sure. I definitely did not want to stop to get a better look. When we finally made it back to the trailer, I made sure that Brian and I stayed inside. I told my parents what I saw, but I don't think they believed me. But then again, I was also pretty unsure of it myself, and obviously, Brian couldn't back me up on this. This is where things began to escalate. That night, I remember waking up to Brian having one of his episodes waking up everyone. He was pointing out the window in absolute terror. There was something outside that was terrifying Brian. We didn't have any external lights on the trailer in order to look around. My parents figured it was just Brian sleepwalking. Typically when Brian sleepwalks, we can get him back to bed quite easily. But Brian didn't seem to want to calm down. We covered the blinds and made sure Brian was calmed. That took some time, but obviously we got into bed. We woke up the next morning to an interesting sight. Just outside the trailer were these weird footprints that circled around the trailer. It looked as if someone was crawling around all night. Initially, my parents thought it was Brian that was somehow able to escape the trailer last night. But after a quick review of Brian's feet, that obviously couldn't have been the case. The prints were very strange, and they looked almost human. It almost looked like someone was crawling around on their hands and feet, except the hands and feet were exceptionally large. The suspicion quickly went from Brian to perhaps a crazy person that happened to know where we lived. If that was the case, it would be quite a comical prank, if this was left at that, but it wasn't. My parents seemed to be uneasy about this. They didn't like the idea that someone was circling our trailer, and I don't blame them. Whenever I looked out into the woods, I'd always get this bad feeling, and I think my parents felt it also. Instead of wanting to go out and play in the woods, Brian and I just stayed inside for that day. We felt safer inside. That night, I remember waking up to a strange sound. My first thought was that it was Brian sleepwalking around the trailer, but after further review, Brian was fast asleep and the sounds were coming from outside. It sounded as if something was being scraped on the outside of our trailer. Of course, it was the part of the trailer that didn't have any windows. Not thinking much of it, I decided to open the door and go outside, but right before I opened the door, my father grabbed me. "Don't open that door," he said in a very stern voice. My father was clutching a shotgun and he looked terrified. "I got a glimpse of it," he said. My father's eyes were wide and he looked serious. "I don't know what it is, but it's not human." I was about to speak, then my father cut me off. Well, I thought I heard something outside, and I thought it was Brian. But after seeing Brian on the couch, I decided to go and investigate. I was able to peer through the windows and get a glimpse of it. The thing was very pale, and it walked on all fours. I didn't get a look at its face, but just by looking at its limbs, I could tell it wasn't human. The creature that my father was describing matched the description of the creature that I saw inside the cave. A sense of dread had just washed over me. I think that whatever it was had followed me from the cave to my trailer. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but I do remember waking up and looking outside. On all the trees near the trailer were these 3 scratch marks that looked similar to the ones that were near the cave. There were also some scratch marks on our trailer. This thing had very sharp claws. After seeing all of this, as well as seeing the creature, my father took very little convincing into moving the trailer. He moved it to the other side of the property that was much farther away from the tree line, and from this new location, we experienced no activity from the creature. My theory was that it liked to live in the woods in order to hunt and to be concealed from the daylight. That would explain the pale skin. While we were on the other side of the property, my family was able to build a house over time. This took about 5 years, but it was well worth the wait. The new house that we had built allowed each person to have their own room. This was able to give me a normal sleep schedule, and I barely ever heard Brian sleepwalk. The more years that went by for Brian, his sleepwalking got worse. If anyone ever left the door unlocked, we would find Brian some decent way away from the home on the property. I remember the morning waking up finding my mother pacing around the kitchen frantically. My dad and Brian were nowhere to be seen. I was able to put 2 and 2 together and figure out what had happened. Brian had sleptwalked the night before and someone left the door unlocked. My dad was out searching for him. Typically, we found Brian pretty quickly in the morning, but today, we couldn't find him. I went outside to help assist my dad finding Brian. It didn't take me very long to find him out on the property. Remember, we had a lot of acres, so searching for Brian could take some time. I helped search the majority of the property with my father. After searching for some hours, we finally reached the part of the property that we had been with the trailer that many years ago. My father and I searched quickly. We didn't want to stay there very long. That's when we heard it. We could hear the bells on Brian's anklet ringing. Brian must have been close. The ringing was coming from deep inside the woods. My father and I had to place our fear aside in order to find Brian. We slowly crept inside the woods, looking for Brian, following the sounds. My father and I could hear the bells off into the distance. We followed the sounds, ignoring the dangers that were nearby. I began to feel that dreadful feeling again. As we were walking in the woods, my father and I came across a terrible sight. There was blood all over the ground. There was no body of any animals nearby. Naturally, my father and I thought the worst, but we didn't say anything to each other. "Something very terrible has happened here," my father said. We could still hear the bells ringing off into the distance. There was still hope that Brian was still okay. We continued to follow the bells until it led us to its final destination. The bells had led us to the cave. The cave was bigger than I remembered. It looked much bigger and much darker than before. I was about to walk into the cave before my father grabbed me by the shoulder. "Hey, we don't know what's in there," my father said grimly. I shook my father's hand off my shoulder. "Of course we know what's in there. That's Brian. That's his bells," I told him. My father and I began to argue at the mouth of the cave. While we were arguing, the bells had stopped ringing. My father and I then peered into the cave, expecting anything to emerge. We heard the bells slowly get closer. Instead of being excited, I felt this extreme dread, as if the impending doom was coming out of this cave. We then heard screeching. My father and I immediately bolted out of the area. The screeching continued. We continued running until we were out of the woods. Whatever it was that was following us did not leave the woods. We went back to the house silently. It was as if both my father and I knew the actual outcome of Brian. We got back to the house and my father called the police. I talked to my mother, telling her that the trail of Brian went cold. She was pretty devastated. The police came about 2 hours later and my father led them to the area in which we thought Brian was. He had led them to the mouth of the cave. The officers entered the cave with their weapons drawn and flashlights. They were in the cave for about 5 minutes before they quickly returned. They told us that the cave was littered with animal bones. They said that this was very common for a bear cave. One of the officers reached into his pocket and pulled out an object. The object rang like Brian's bells, except they were covered in blood and were tattered up. The officer asked, "Does this mean anything to you guys?" My father solemnly nodded his head. During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange, human-like creature sparked brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little or no information was left intact, as most of online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused in rural New York State and once found in Idaho, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters with a creature of unknown origin. Emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remain powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group and was able to get some excerpts from the upcoming book. A Suicide Note, 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage my guilt or pain I have introduced to this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him. For once, I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again, I awoke and heard his voice, and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to experience. I cannot ever wake. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. "Dearest Lenny, I prayed for you. He spoke your name." A journal entry, translated from Spanish, 1880. "I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They're hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand. I will not sleep. His voice." A Mariner's Log, 1691. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed, I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again, at the request of the Rake. From a witness, 2006. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip from Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids right to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he got out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly his knees almost knocked me out of the bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for half a second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around the side of the bed, and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of motion right along the side of the bed until it was less than a foot from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds, just looking at my husband. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hall leading to the kids' room. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop him before hurting my children. When I got into the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouched and hunched over about 20 feet away. He turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter, Clara. The creature ran down the stairs while my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and only spoke once more in her short life. She said, "He is the Rake." My husband drove his car into a lake that night while rushing our daughter to the hospital. They did not survive. Being a small town, the news got around pretty quickly. The police were pretty helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was neither published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got in contact and began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now refer to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any detail, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 3 pages and never mentioned it again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the Rake. That was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night, for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the record at 8 times the normal speed. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I've heard it before, and I now believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I've not seen the Rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while he slept. I know and fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me. In 2006, I was living in a small town in Utah where I used to manage rental properties up in the mountains. The events I'm about to speak of are not covered by the news. The people that do speak about these events are often labeled conspiracy theorists and not taken seriously. At the time, my business was growing quite exponentially. The more my business grew, the more rental properties I was able to make deeper and farther up the mountain. The people loved the properties. Something about being secluded up in the mountains was very attractive to people. Everything was going fine until one day I got a call from one of my workers. He said that he was clearing land on a new property that we just purchased and saw something strange. At first, he said that he thought it was a mound of dirt, but upon further review, he saw that it was something more sinister. The mound of dirt turned out to be a mound of flesh. The mound was comprised of skin and bone of animals. There is no animal that I know of that would do this. This must have been a person, a very sick and demented person. Why would he leave a mound of skin and bone out in the middle of the woods? I told my worker to remove the mound and get back to work, which he hesitantly did. I showed up at the site about 30 minutes later. The site was pretty deep into the woods up into the mountain, deeper than I've ever been. During the build at this location, I'd have workers tell me that they've seen something in the woods, stalking them. This could have very well been a cougar, which are quite popular in this area. I told my workers to be alert at all times, and for all project managers to carry a firearm. This property was trouble from the start. For whatever reason, I had builders and construction workers quit on me, saying that they didn't feel safe this far into the mountains. This was silly to me. I used them in all my other properties before, and they didn't have any issues. They kept saying something to me about a presence in the mountains, something watching them. I was finally able to hire a contractor that was able to finish the property. He did a pretty decent job, although he was kind of expensive. I was able to find tenants for the property, and I continued building other locations. 3 properties later, I get the same call from a different worker, saying that they saw a mound of flesh in the woods. I remember what had happened last time, and I told him not to touch it, and that I'd be right there. A part of me didn't believe what I was hearing. There's no way there's a mound of flesh just sitting out in the woods. I figured he was exaggerating. But sure enough, when I showed up, there certainly was a mound of flesh. The smell was terrible, but the bugs were probably worse. Sure enough, there was about a 4-foot mound of flesh that someone placed out in the woods. I debated with one of my workers that maybe this was a gut pile of a larger animal, but that still wouldn't explain the organization of the flesh into a pile. Predators up in the mountains typically eat most of the animal. This mound seemed to be comprised of 4 different animals, all compiled into one. The skin that had been removed looked almost surgical, as if someone did it with a razor's edge. Instead of removing the mound, I told my worker to contact the police. Nothing came of it, but I just figured it'd be a good idea to get something on record. This new property was different from the last one. Something about the atmosphere was more intense. It was as if I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, as if there was a part of the forest that was forbidden. At this point in the story, I started getting calls from tenants, mainly the newer ones, saying how their pets have gone missing. They wanted to know if there were any predators in the area, and I told them no. That was an obvious lie. I then started getting reports about people peering into windows. Like I said before, the area is pretty secluded. The reports were that there was a pale man peering into windows, but only at night. Things started to get more serious when actual tenants went missing. We only found that they went missing since they were not able to check out at one of the properties. These were the same people that claimed that there was someone peering into the house. I contacted the police and told them what had happened. They went up to the property and collected what evidence they could. There was not much that they could do. The police told me that they figured that they just went hiking up in the mountains and got lost. To be fair, that is a probable explanation. I continued to rent out properties. I acted as if nothing had happened. I suppose that is wrong of me. But there was no way for me to know what was going to happen. About 2 months later, I started getting reports about a pale man walking around on all fours out in the woods. He would be seen just outside of homes, peering in and out of houses. At the same time, tenants would go missing. This was the point I was starting to put the two connections together. It was as if the houses that he was peering into, those people would go missing. I contacted the police again, except this time, rather than the police, a government agency came out and investigated. They came out in unmarked vehicles, and with heavy weaponry. They came and stayed at one of my properties, in hopes to find some of the missing tenants. They asked me permission to reinforce the entryways to the buildings. I agreed, as long as they kept me updated on what was going on. 2 weeks in, and I get a disturbing phone call late at night. I am told that I have to remove all of my tenants on the mountain out of the houses. I asked for a further explanation and asked to meet up in the morning. I go to one of the homes at which the investigation is taking place. The agents are waiting for me outside. Outside the house, there are these huge crates that are labeled hazardous. There was about 4 of them, and I was not able to get a great look at them. The agents then told me something very disturbing about the mountain. They were able to disclose that they found the missing tenants. They were found in a meat pile not too far away. They then told me something that I'm not sure that I believe. They told me that these attacks were caused by rabid bears that lived in the mountain. All of my time working here on the mountain, I'd never seen a bear once, so I'm not sure what I believe. They also told me that I was not able to rent out any properties on the mountain anymore. This was quite devastating. I pressed them for answers as to why I was not able to work anymore and what actually happened on the mountain. They told me that the information was classified. Before the agents left, one of the agents said something to me that keeps me up at night. He said, "Whatever these things are, there's more than one of them." I grew up wealthy all my life because my family owned a fish processing plant in Alaska. Because of this, I would often visit up in Alaska in a private plane that my family owned in order to overlook the operation every couple of months. We recently hired on a new project manager, and unfortunately, he has been causing some issues recently, which required me to make my trips more frequently. On these trips, I was able to land on my family's private airstrip on our 300-acre land, which was next to our family cabin and air hangar. This may sound a bit eccentric, but when you fly as much as I do, in all honesty, I was probably saving money traveling this way rather than flying commercial. For the record, I have my pilot's license and have been flying since I was 18. That's one of the perks of being born in a family that is able to provide the necessary resources to fly at such a young age. During the time of this story, my plane was an older model that my father learned to fly on some time ago, and I was in the market for a new one. I had the money for a new plane, but I just got behind on some of my tasks, and I didn't have time to find a plane that could take the beatings that my trips would require. Needless to say that this caused me to exercise some unnecessary risk of flying a plane that should have been probably scrapped at this point. I got a call at 11 in the morning, and I was told that the project manager had no called no showed for the past 3 days. I was obviously furious and had made arrangements to fire this recent hire and restart the hiring process. I was frustrated in knowing that I would have to restart the hiring process, which I really wasn't wanting to do, since I'd have to do that in person. For reference, it was early winter, late fall, which made my travels all the more difficult. I try to avoid the Alaskan winters whenever I can, but due to the events at my factory, I was forced to be there. I got a forecast of the weather to see if it would be possible to land my aircraft at my personal landing strip, which would seem questionable. I would not be able to land my aircraft if there was any snow on the strip, but I was hoping that it was early enough in the season that snow has yet to fall. I spent the rest of the day getting preparations done on the aircraft and called a handful of plant managers, letting them know what plans I had in motion to finally find a solid candidate for the project manager position. I took off from the local airstrip that was 20 minutes from my house in California. I made my way to the Alaskan cabin that was about 7 hours away, flight time. I had made this trip hundreds of times from since I was young to now. I even made this flight drunk a few times. Needless to say, I was confident in my abilities in landing this plane, even in an inch or two of snow. The flight dragged, as it normally did. The sun crept across the sky and dipped behind the horizon just under an hour left of the flight. Normally, I don't fly on such short notice, but this was a business emergency. Unfortunately, this sense of emergency caused me to rush in my preparations, and I was beginning to worry about the snow on the runway. I finally reached the cabin, and I did a flyby to double check the area for snow. It looked like it just started to snow, but it looked landable. I was at a low enough altitude that I could have sworn I saw someone standing on my runway. I figured that this must have been a mistake, and I'd been flying too long. I wanted to double check, so I flew back again. The runway was cleared. I then came back again, extra slow, but my landing went better than it should have. Like I said, I had done it a million times, so a small amount of snow would not affect me. I stepped out of my aircraft and opened the hangar and pulled in my plane. The hangar next to my cabin is normally left unlocked due to it being out in the middle of nowhere. It was capable of being locked, but in the cold times like now, I preferred to leave it unlocked to make my time in the snow as small as possible. I pulled the plane in and made my way over to the cabin. Quick backstory about the cabin. The cabin was built by my father's grandpa. Obviously, I didn't meet him since he passed before I was born, but he was a real man's man. He originally built the cabin as a small hunting lodge to hunt moose and bears during the hunting season. That being said, we had wildlife everywhere. Bears were common, but they were always more afraid of you than you were of them. However, bears will never turn down an easy snack. Thus, keeping the cabin locked was essential. The nearest Walmart was about 3 hours away, which made stocking up the pantry an issue at times. It was always key to leave the pantry full on non-perishable food. That way, you would have some food when you'd come back next season. If a bear found its way inside, it could have plenty to eat. One thing we used was a bear mat, which was basically a piece of wood with nails inside of it, facing up, to prevent bears from coming in. You would place this board on top of your doormat, so if a bear stepped on it, it wouldn't want to come inside. This does sound cruel, but bears' paws are very rough and would only do enough damage to scare them off. I walked up to my cabin door, and to my surprise, the bear mat and most of my porch is covered in a black liquid. Blood, when dried or frozen, can appear to be black, but it still caught me off guard. I noticed on the door and windows black handprints. Did someone try to come into my cabin and step on my bear mat? I stood mystified outside in the snow for only a minute before the cold air snapped me out of it and ushered me inside. I quickly turned on all the lights and heat, still puzzled with what I saw. The bear mats would not have been able to penetrate most shoes due to the nails being too close together, due to the displacement of weight, which means whoever stepped on my bear mat was extremely heavy or was barefoot. I'm honestly surprised that a hiker would have somehow found my cabin, but even more so that whoever it was barefoot. I was not able to shake the feeling that someone could still be nearby, like a dark cloud just hanging overhead. I did a quick walk around the cabin, and nothing seemed to be disturbed since I last visited. My anxiety slowly eased away, but not completely. All the doors were still locked as well as the windows, but I did see more black handprints on other windows. I was hoping whoever had done this was here a few months ago, not recently. This helped me come to the conclusion that I was somewhat safe in my cabin. I got situated and ready for bed since the next day I would be running around a good bit. The night was cold and the wind howled, but nothing happened. I woke up early the next morning and got the day started. I was on my laptop for the first hour or two before I went out to the hangar. Out in the hangar, we have a truck that we leave there purposely for us to drive around. Whenever I leave, even if it's just in town, I make sure to put the bear mat back out. I drove into town, which is always a long drive, but this time it was beautiful with the sun slowly rising. The Alaskan wilderness always reminded me how beautiful Earth really was. I arrived into town just before noon and made my way into the processing plant. Once there, I felt the energy of my employees shift from horsing around to strict business. I could tell that they were used to goofing off while I wasn't there, which I really didn't mind as long as they got their stuff done. I did a quick tour of the plant and went from meeting to meeting before I left. I went into Walmart and bought a bunch of food I could heat up since I felt that I'd be there a while before I found a replacement project manager. I made the long drive home, and at this time the sun had already set. My headlights illuminated only so much of the road since it was an older model truck. I made it home and I started to unload the groceries. The dried blood that I had yet to remove from the door reminded me of my unwelcome guest that was once here. I felt a small chill go down my spine, but I brushed it off. I finally unloaded and parked the truck inside the hangar, and while leaving, I contemplated locking the hangar. This is something I haven't done in a while, but with the black handprints on my door, my mind did wander. I ignored the thought and left the hangar unlocked. At this point I realized that the snow had gained a few inches from when I left this morning. While walking inside, I half expected to see some animal tracks in the snow, but nothing. Just a clear blanket of fresh snow. I went inside and started a fire in the fireplace. The crackling of the burning wood added a calming background noise as the cabin began to warm. I hopped on my laptop looking at my emails for new candidates to hire for the position in the kitchen that was next to the window when I thought I saw something move outside. My heart skipped a beat. But then I realized it was just the flames of the fire that danced on the window. I went back to my laptop and before I knew it, I was up way too late. I let the fire die as I slept downstairs on the couch. I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud sound hitting the kitchen window. The sound not only woke me, but caused me to jump, knocking over my laptop. More frustrated than I was scared, I picked up my laptop and placed it on the counter. I went to investigate the sound that woke me. At first glance, the window appeared to be normal, still having the black handprints I kept forgetting to remove. But something caught my eye. I noticed that there was a handprint that didn't fit in with the black ones. This handprint was red, and it was slowly dripping down the outside of the window. This handprint was fresh. My mind was still groggy from being torn from such a peaceful slumber, and I was not able to comprehend the meaning of this. A feeling of immense dread hit my stomach like a ton of bricks when I finally realized that someone was outside watching me sleep. I went upstairs to my nightstand, where I have a loaded .44 Magnum for any bears that might find their way inside. I went back downstairs and I turned on my porch lights. To my horror, the once fresh snow was now clearly disturbed and bloodied. It appeared that whoever was outside had circled my cabin and peered in multiple windows. My hands sweated as it gripped the rubber pistol grip. I was tempted to go outside, but the cold and my nerves got the best of me, and I decided against it. I didn't get much sleep that night, but I eventually managed to get a few hours of sleep with my pistol nearby. I woke up in the morning later than normal due to the events prior and hurried through my morning ritual of getting ready. Once I went through my emails and had my coffee, I went outside to see that the freshly covered snow had covered the trail of my midnight watcher. I then looked at the windows and doors and decided that this was the time for me to clean them quickly with some paper towels and degreaser. The black marks were oddly thicker than I thought they would be. Blood isn't normally this thick. This was much more like tar of some kind. I quickly removed the marks and went over to my hangar to get my truck. The hangar, despite being unlocked, was undisturbed, which pleasantly surprised me. I got in the truck and made my journey into town. During my drive, I couldn't stop thinking about the night before and how I felt so violated to have someone watch me sleep. What kind of person would want to watch me sleep out in the cold? Why were their hands bloodied? Did they try to come in and step on the bear mat again? This made me shiver at the thought of someone trying to enter with me sleeping right there. My day continued to pass slowly, with the night always lingering in the back of my mind. The more I would dread it, the quicker it would seem to come. After an unproductive day of interviews, I went back to venture out to my lonely wilderness cabin that I now feared rather than embraced. I arrived home and I looked at the snow before pulling into the hangar to see if my night watcher had returned. The snow showed no signs of anything unusual, so I proceeded to the hangar. I exited the truck, and instead of leaving the hangar unlocked, I decided to lock it. Whatever that was out here with me has gotten inside my head. I spent the nighttime upstairs rather than down in my kitchen. I wanted to remove any possibility of unwanted eyes watching me. The wind howled through the thick trees, which every now and again almost sounded like the screams of an angry beast. That night went on without a hitch, although my pistol stayed nearby. I woke up the next morning and looked outside to see that the snow had gained another foot or so, but thankfully remained undisturbed. A slight relief to my frantic mind assured me that whatever was lingering around the cabin had surely left. I got distracted that morning trying to set up plans for more interviews, and I accidentally forgot to put the bear mat back in front of the door. I didn't realize this until I was halfway into the city, and I wasn't wanting to drive back just to move that mat a few feet. I figured that I would be okay and that most of the bears should have started hibernation by now. Work went by pretty quickly, and I had a good productive day. I had a few interviews that I felt good about, and I had some solid candidates on my hands. The big thing that I was looking for was experience and reliability. As much as I enjoyed coming up to Alaska, I wasn't wanting to be up here more than I needed to be. The day went by so well that I almost forgot about everything that had happened the nights before. I also forgot about not placing that bear mat back in front of the door. It wasn't until I pulled back up to the cabin that I realized that I made a huge mistake. I was startled to see that the lights in the cabin were on. Normally, I was pretty good at remembering to turn those off, but I'm not perfect. I pulled up to the porch area to see that my front door was wide open. I definitely didn't leave the door open. My pistol was left inside, but I thought ever so briefly that I'd be able to sneak in and grab it before searching the rest of the cabin. I exited my truck, leaving it still outside, and I slowly went inside. Thankfully, I left my pistol downstairs, which was not too difficult to get. I made sure that the gun was loaded, and I took the safety off. I then realized that there was a trail of blood leading from the door, heading to the upstairs. I slowly followed, gun in hand. While walking upstairs, I was able to hear these indescribable sounds. The sounds were so foreign to me that I was genuinely curious as to what was going on. I slowly reached my room, where the sounds were much more clear. I opened the door quickly to surprise whoever was in there, but when I opened my room, I was completely horrified at the sight that laid before me. It was too much for my mind to process at first. I didn't even know what I was looking at, but there was a human-like creature eating a small moose on the ground. The creature resembled a human, but its limbs were too long and it had horns on its head. Its skin was white but withered away and covered in blood. I cried out in horror as I looked upon this demonic creature feeding. The creature looked up quickly, bearing long, sharp teeth that still had flesh inside. Not knowing what to do, I quickly aimed the pistol at the creature and fired until it was empty. The creature took a good number of shots, but only reacted to the last one that killed it. The last bullet connected with its horned skull, and it died. The creature began to spasm all over the floor while spewing blood everywhere. As I watched the creature, it slowly changed shape from this grotesque beast to something that began to look more and more human. This made me more afraid to see what now appeared before me was a lifeless man laying on the floor. What just happened? How did it change from this demonic beast to this old-looking man? I frantically paced the upstairs, not knowing what to do, when I heard a sound coming from downstairs. a sound that sounded much like the thing I just killed. I went to lock the upstairs door, and right when I did, I heard a loud slam on the other side. The door didn't hold for long when I saw long limbs trying to reach through. I ran to the window and looked down from the second story to see a descent of 15 feet or so. I turned around to see a very similar creature now completely inside the room. My options were to jump from this height or stay and definitely die a violent death. I took my chances from this height and I jumped. The beast seemed preoccupied with whatever it was I just killed upstairs, because instead of following me immediately, it waited. I laid in the snow, and thankfully I was unharmed. I anticipated a violent flurry of limbs coming out of the window, but nothing. I quickly hurried to the only place I thought to be safe, which was the hangar. I reached the hangar and entered quickly. I looked back at the cabin to see the deranged figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, but it was also slim. It stared at me with seething hatred that I could feel radiating off of its evil eyes. The distance between myself and the creature was enough that I could easily enter the hangar before it would reach me, and I took this time to look at it. I felt like I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. It was as if I had entered a dimension that accommodated devilish beasts. The mood of complete adrenaline and fear slowly melted into extreme sadness and sorrow. I could feel myself being overtaken with powerful thoughts of increasing negativity and pain. Somehow at the source of all of this, I knew that this creature was somehow responsible. I entered and closed the hangar door before I became overwhelmed with these feelings. I could feel my grip on reality slightly alter in a way that I've yet to regain to this day. I entered the hangar and started my truck. I activated the hangar door and got inside the truck. When the hangar door opened, I saw that the creature had gone and the cabin remained open. I pulled the truck next to the cabin and listened outside for any signs of that thing, but thankfully, I heard nothing. I decided that instead of going to the next town, I would see if my cabin was cleared, and if it was, I'd just stay the night in the cabin. I lost my gun in all of the commotion, but I did arm myself with a large steak knife. I could feel a dark cloud lift from earlier, and I could tell that whatever those two things were, that they were no longer here. I went upstairs to find my room in complete disarray and the door barely hanging on the hinge. There was no sign of the body of the old man. There were stains of blood everywhere and claw marks on the floors and wall. The body of the small moose remained half-eaten in the center of the room as a grim reminder of those hellish beasts. I called the next morning to the nearest police station and reported what I saw. I was transferred a few times until I finally reached the chief of police, and he said that he wanted to come personally to my cabin to get more information. The police came later that day, and I was forced to stay home rather than go to work. The police came, but when I told them my story of what had happened, they completely dismissed what I said about the beasts and told me that I actually saw a rare breed of bear that lived in the area. This could not have been true. Those creatures had no fur on them, and they had horns or antlers. I was tempted to tell them that I killed one and that it turned into an old man. But I was afraid that if I did, they would either think that I was crazy or that I actually killed someone and used the story to cover it up. Needless to say, the police were no help, and I made arrangements to leave Alaska the following day. I was unable to get a new project manager for my company and ended up outsourcing the responsibility to another company. I've yet to fly again since my old plane was still in that hangar next to the cabin. I don't think I'll ever go back, and considering what I saw, I would say that I'm just lucky to be alive.
We owned property up in northern Idaho where my family would, naturally, farm potatoes. Yes, I know, cliché. We own a couple of 100 acres with little to no people nearby. Growing up, I have only seen 3 people drive by our farm. One was our neighbor looking for his lost horse, and the other 2 were college kids that got lost on their way to Canada. With our farm being so large, we have random sets of barns to house fuel and other machinery on and around the farm. In all, we have about 5 or so barns around the farm, and we were told to always keep the barns closed. I somewhat laughed at this idea since nothing was out here but random deer and coyotes. I remember one summer, my sister left a barn door open and we had issues with raccoons for the rest of the year. I was the second oldest and was responsible for harvesting crops and storing them in the barns, while my father would go barn to barn, collecting the harvest for the year. Like I said, I was the second oldest. My older brother Trevor died when I was young in a tragic accident with one of the tractors. I was only 10 at the time and he was 17. I remember my father coming in late one night, covered in blood, crying with my mother. Apparently my brother left the tractor in neutral and the tractor rolled on top of him, crushing him. My father went out to look for him when he didn't show for dinner. My father was never the same after that night, and neither was the family. Instead of being able to drive at 14 like my brother, I had to wait until I was 18 to drive one of the tractors. That was only because my father was running low on help and I had to talk him into it for 4 years. I would like to either go in the mornings or late at night when the air was cool, since our tractors were old and didn't have AC. My father would stay up late until I would come in from the late nights of harvesting crops. He would never go to bed until I would come in. During those nights of harvesting, I would see some interesting sights, some of which were haunting. I remember once I ran over a small deer that was laying in the tall crops. It was quite gruesome and caught me off guard. Blood went everywhere, and I had to clean the tractor for 30 minutes the next day. I saw the remains of what looked like a calf that was eaten by wolves on my way back inside from a harvest. Normally something like this doesn't faze me at all, but coming in at 2 in the morning after harvesting, it was a bit spooky. The barn nearest the house was a brisk 15-minute walk, and after seeing that and making that walk with nothing but the moonlight to guide you, it was sure to send a shiver down your spine. Something happened one night, something I never did tell my dad, but I think I saw something imitate my dead brother. Not like another person, but a creature, something intelligent but evil. So here is what happened. Like I said before, we were told to always keep the doors closed on the barns on the property. Well, I began to get lazy the later my harvest got, and the closer the barn was to the house, the more likely I figured that no one or nothing too deadly would try to stay in the barn that we couldn't remove on our own. It wasn't that big of a deal, but keeping the door open would save me from having to hop out of the tractor and open the somewhat heavy barn door. It would save me literally less than 1 minute of time, but coming in late after spending hours harvesting late at night would make a big difference in my teenage mind. The day started off like any other, and school dragged on like it normally did. I was driving home from school, not really paying attention to the road when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. As I slowed down, I noticed a large, hairy animal dart quickly across the road. It looked like a wolf, but it was standing up on 2 legs. It ran as if it was wounded, but it moved so fast, impossibly fast. As quickly as the creature entered my view, it left, only leaving a small trail of dust in its path. The direction the creature was running, it would reach my family's farm in the next 3 miles, but the likelihood that the thing continued straight was very unlikely. The rest of the drive home I was freaked out, mainly because I almost crashed my car, but also I have never seen anything that big, that fast in this area. I remember one summer I went and visited my uncle in Alaska, and we went and hunted moose. Kinda reminded me of that, but the speed was unlike anything I've ever seen. I arrived home, and the creature seemed to have escaped my mind when I saw my mother had cooked my favorite pie. After 2 slices of pie, a tall glass of milk, and some of the Jets vs. Patriots on ESPN, I was ready to get my chores done on the farm. I got old Betsy, aka the rusty green tractor, fired up and began my route to harvest potatoes, leaving the barn door open. The tractor was equipped with these old headlights that I would use to see ahead for about 30 feet or so. For the most part they were terrible, but considering there was nothing for me to hit in these fields, I was in good hands. I was halfway through my route when I began to smell this terrible smell. Smelled much like that deer I hit with the tractor, but much worse. It had a weird metallic smell, like a burnt metal smell. For a moment, I thought old Betsy needed a new belt, but we just replaced it last year. They lasted for 5 years easy. I made sure to keep my eyes open as I continued driving in the endless fields that laid ahead of me, and my home, just hoping I wouldn't have a breakdown in the middle of the field. If that were to happen, it would take me an hour or so to get back. Thankfully, the tractor didn't break down and I continued my route. I was working my way back when the tractor lights briefly scanned across an open field, and I saw something large moving quickly, just barely out of my sight. It was headed to the barn that I foolishly left open. My mind raced back to earlier in the day when I saw that creature. It looks like it somehow ended up on my farm. Luckily, I was in Betsy, which was near impossible to enter while I was driving. Unfortunately, I did have to park it inside the barn I left open, and would have to make the 15-minute walk back to the house with nothing to protect me. I sheepishly drove back to the barn after a few hours of collecting potatoes. The smell of the burnt metal was incredibly strong, and I began to feel this intense evil feeling in the air. I opened the barn door, which I left ajar, and quickly entered the tractor to pull it in. The lights on the tractor illuminated the barn. The barns were a mess and had tools and parts laying around. It wouldn't be that difficult to hide if you really wanted to. I made sure to double check the barn, although while inside the tractor to make sure nothing got in while I was away. After waiting for 5 or so minutes, I turned off the key to the tractor, which in turn turned off my light source from inside the barn. Thankfully the moon was out, and it was able to cast some light inside the old barn. I exited the tractor and made sure to refuel the tractor before I left. As I was returning the empty fuel can, I heard my name, although it was completely distorted. It sounded like someone was speaking with damaged lungs and a really raspy voice, like they had been smoking for 50 years. My first thought was that a hobo had entered the barn or something, but then I realized the voice was calling my name. How did it know my name? I then thought that my father was out in the barn trying to scare me. It wouldn't be the first time my father gave me a good scare, but it was very late for someone to pull a prank like this. I was able to catch a small glimpse of something that looked tall and hairy in the corner of the barn. I immediately turned tail and ran towards my home. This was a ridiculous endeavor. I was in no shape to be outrunning anything, let alone whatever I saw earlier that was running at those speeds. I heard what sounded like a large animal thrashing around in the barn and then hot on my trail. I was halfway to the house when I heard what sounded like my dead brother calling me by my nickname that no one ever called me but him. I stupidly turned around to see the outline of my brother, but he looked like he had been hit by a car. His neck and limbs were all bent and pieces of flesh were hanging off of him. It was hard to tell what exactly I was looking at, since I felt like I was going to die from all the running and the thought of a large creature trying to kill me. I knew whatever it was trying to pretend to be my brother must have had something to do with his death. How did it know what he looked like? How did he know my nickname only my brother called me? I continued running and made it back to the house. The entire time, I could hear it breathing behind me. I made the 15-minute walk into a 5-minute run. I no longer harvest late at night, and I now have questions about how that creature knew so much about my brother to be able to imitate him like that. Regardless, I felt lucky to be alive, and yes, I no longer leave the barn door open.
Ghosts are something that me and my family have experienced quite frequently. This is my personal story as the narrator and author for this channel. It all started when I was young. I was about 5 years old and my family had moved houses. The house that we moved to was built by my parents, so naturally, no one would have been able to have died there. My house was the last house on the left. It was kind of tucked away back in the corner. The right side of the house and backyard was covered with endless woods. The woods went on for what seemed like forever. We moved into the house and everything seemed fine. The house was 2 stories plus a basement. The basement was unfinished, and it always had a creepy factor to it. My house was on a hill and the backyard sloped downwards. The woods in my backyard kind of had a swampy feel to it, and there was mud pretty much everywhere. I remember the day that the paranormal activity started. I was about 6 at this time. We'd been living in the house for about a year. I was out in the woods one afternoon when I started to hear what sounded like a drum beating in the distance. Being so young and curious, I followed the sounds into the woods. It wasn't until I got closer that I started to hear chanting. The chanting wasn't in English, but for some reason, it still made me uncomfortable. At this point, my curiosity was being overpowered by my fear, and I decided to turn around. Before I started walking back, I started to feel a presence only a couple of yards away. The presence felt dark and angry. I walked back to my house and I thought nothing of it. That dark presence lingered the entire time. Whatever it was, whatever lingered, followed me home that day. Ever since then, we would see a man that looked to be covered in mud in our backyard. We would only see him for but a moment before he would disappear back into the woods. Thankfully, whatever it was would stay near the woods. Things would change when I would get older. The mudman would get much closer to the house as time went on. It got to the point that we would sometimes see him peering into our windows. There were 2 occasions where my mother saw the mudman peering into our house. Naturally, she called the police both times, to which they were not able to do anything. I remember one night that my mother was cleaning when she accidentally spilt 2 chemicals together. In fear that she created toxic fumes, she left all the windows and doors to our house open in order to air out the chemicals. The next morning, we were horrified to find a set of muddy footprints leading into our house. After a quick search of the house, we found no one inside. We never saw the mudman again, however things inside of our home would change. The paranormal activity started in our basement. The basement was dark and unfinished, and hardly no one went down there, although at night we would hear sounds coming from down below. We would never check during the night, but we would the next day, to which we would never find anything. The basement did have a furnace and a water heater, so we figured maybe that's what was causing the noise, and we just didn't notice it before. We would always keep the basement door locked. Me and my siblings were always terrified of the basement. We feared that if we ever left it unlocked, whatever was down there would come up and get us. I remember that our bedrooms weren't too far from the basement door. Sometimes late at night, we could swear that we would sometimes hear the door handle jingle. It was as if something down there was trying to come up. Thankfully, as long as we kept the basement door locked, whatever was down there would seem to stay down there. I remember one night, whatever the reason, we forgot to lock the basement door. This would be a huge mistake. I remember hearing the sound of the door handle jingling and eventually opening. I remember seeing the next morning the basement door being wide open. Whatever was down in the basement was now upstairs in the house. The presence wouldn't really do much, it would just linger. I think something about it didn't like the light. That's why it stayed in the basement for so long. Weird things would happen. Doors would open. We would hear random footsteps throughout the house. Our dogs would bark at nothing. It loved to open our doors at night, setting off our alarm system, waking up everyone. As time would pass, we would just kind of get used to these weird things. It was just part of the house at this point. My friends were always uncomfortable. They wanted nothing to do with the basement. As I got older, my parents decided to finish the basement. This took about 6 to 8 months, but once it was finished, they decided to put me and my brother's bedrooms down there. This was quite terrifying. Our bedrooms were next to the furnace room, to where we think it lived. At night, we would often hear it lunk around in that other room, but eventually the presence would eventually make its way into our rooms. The presence wasn't necessarily evil, it was just curious. At night, I would often hear it move around my room, and it would shuffle its feet on the carpet. Things started to get worse when I became a teenager. I started to get depression, and whatever it was seemed to feed off of it, making it stronger. Instead of just shuffling around and acting curious, this seemed to be more invasive. I think that it realized that if it made me depressed, that it could feed off of it and become stronger. My nights became plagued by this thing. I could feel this thing hovering over me as I tried to sleep. And once I was asleep, I would get these awful nightmares. These nightmares were the most severe and most vivid dreams I've ever had. I remember one night being woken up because my bed was shaking. I was covered in sweat and I was completely terrified. I felt like I was being surrounded by this darkness that was going to kill me. The hauntings would continue even after I would leave for college. My parents would tell me that they would still hear sounds coming from the basement. Things eventually worked out that we ended up moving, and thankfully all of those things stayed behind. I have another personal ghost story that I thought I'd share with you. It's not terribly long, so I thought I'd throw it in here. One day I was driving home from high school. It was about 4:30 or 5, and I was coming home from practice. It was August, so it was still summertime, and the temperature was in the high 90s. As I was driving, I looked out my window to see a woman dressed in old colonial clothes. She was in all white. Keep in mind, I do come from an area where there are a lot of Civil War reenactments, so when I saw this, I initially wasn't afraid. When I passed her in my car, I looked in my rearview mirror to see her again, but she was gone. Like I said, it wasn't a terribly long story and not necessarily scary, just odd. When I was younger and still living in that haunted house, my family decided to take a trip down to Florida. This trip was part vacation, part business trip for my dad. My dad picked a hotel that was allegedly haunted. The hotel was old, but also quite nice. At night, my dad, myself, and brother would go out in the hotel and go ghost hunting. Obviously, we didn't really see anything, but we still had fun. On the last night there, we asked one of my dad's coworkers, who was also staying at that hotel, if he wanted to come ghost hunting with us. He declined, but little did he know, he would have an experience more terrifying than all of us. We had our ghost hunt and nothing happened. The next morning, we met up with my dad's coworker at breakfast. When we sat down for breakfast, he looked at us and said, "You guys aren't going to believe what happened to me last night." We listened with eager ears as he told us his story with what happened last night. After declining our ghost hunt, he went to bed quite early. However, in the middle of the night, he was awakened by something standing at the foot of his bed. He described it as a shadow figure. He called out to the figure, asking what he was doing, and the figure took off and ran. It didn't open any doors, but it was gone. It had vanished. He said when it was running off, the figure was silent, but he heard a weird sound. He got up and turned on the lights to examine the room. The figure was gone, and his door was still locked. As he was examining the room, he saw a weird object laying on the floor. The object turned out to be an old skeleton key, which he'd never seen before. He placed the key on his nightstand and went back to bed. He woke up the next morning thinking that whatever had happened the night before was simply just a dream, until he looked over at his nightstand. There sat the skeleton key. It's quite interesting to think that the person that didn't want to go ghost hunting turned out to find the most ghosts out of all of us. This story comes from my dad. He travels for work quite a bit, so naturally, he has to stay in hotels. There was this one time he checked into a hotel, put all of his items down, and went out to dinner with his customers. When he came back to the hotel and tried to enter his room, he noticed that his room key wouldn't work. The door handle, instead of flashing green, flashed red. He double-checked and made sure that he was at the right room and tried again. He was definitely at the right room, so he swiped his key again, but still nothing. He eventually went down to the front counter to see if he could get a new key. They gave him a new one, so he went back and tried again. Still nothing. He went back down to the front counter and told them what had happened. Eventually, they had to call a maintenance guy to come down to help. When finally the maintenance guy arrived, he asked which room it was that needed help. My dad then told him, room 217. The maintenance guy looked in shock. "Oh, that room again," said the maintenance man. The maintenance man eventually told my dad what had happened in that room. About 3 weeks ago, there was a woman stabbed to death in that room. Her body was stuffed in a trunk at the foot of the bed. The maintenance man probably shouldn't have shared this info. They tried to get the door handle to work, and eventually they just had to pry it open. They also noticed that the deadlock on the door was bolted closed from the inside. Once inside, my dad saw that his items were thrown about. His suitcase sat empty on top of the trunk at the foot of the bed. His clothes were thrown about the room. I remember that he told me, out of curiosity, he decided to open the trunk to see what was inside. The carpet on the bottom of the trunk had been removed, and the wood on the bottom of the trunk was stained red. He asked right then and there for another room. This story comes from a Reddit user, SpiritBug165. My first sighting of this being was when I was a little girl staying at my grandmother's house. I would sleep in the living room that was constructed by my late father, and I am about 5 years old. I felt very safe, or I should have. I kind of already been prepped by overhearing stories of how my grandmother had experienced some incidents in the nights that couldn't be explained, like sleep paralysis, weird ongoings, etc. I didn't care to understand them fully. I just thought I'd never have to deal with that because I believed that my late father was always protecting me. Each night I woke up at the exact same time. The same cartoon shows playing on the TV every night is what tipped me off as a kid, not knowing why I was awake, just knowing that I would get to watch crude cartoons that were usually meant for older kids. I would end up looking forward to waking up the first couple of times it would happen. But then, it became different soon. Once I woke up because I heard a woman's voice. Then I felt someone sit down next to me another night. Once I remember plainly that I woke up and I wasn't able to move my body. Not because of sleep paralysis, but because I felt something behind me. I felt that if I stayed still, it would think that I was still asleep and it would go away. This particular incident happened often enough, usually once a night after I would wake up at the usual 3 a.m. time. I didn't tell anyone. Instead, I doubled down on my belief that I had my father to protect me. I remember seeing it out of the corner of my eye, the entire room being covered with big windows and large houseplants. It became very easy to play off that I had an overactive imagination. I would still wake up at 3 a.m. I still sense a female presence actually waking me up, and I still, every night, could sense a tall, dark, broad-shouldered shadow at the corner of the room. It was as if I could feel him beckoning me to turn my head just enough to see it completely. It wasn't a matter of being fast enough either. If you were brave and turned your head quickly, you'd see misshapen shadows of large houseplants and shadows darker than dark. You just couldn't trust what your eyes would see in the shadows when you're a child, and I understood that. But what I couldn't explain is how I already knew what he looked like. How tall he was, so I had no need to try and catch it with my eyes. But I did become brave. Eventually, after being up at 3 a.m. every night, I would get so used to daring myself to look into the shadows. Each night I knew if I was brave enough to walk towards these shadows, I'd be able to make it to the kitchen and get into my grandfather's secret candy stash. For that to happen, I had to face my fears and walk towards the shadows, and through a dark corridor that connected the room I was in with the rest of the house. It was probably the scariest part, seeing the enormous dark man out of my mind's eye, sometimes out of the corner of my eye. You could just feel him there, his shoulders easily a meter and his height at least 10 feet. The shadow was male, and he was darker than black. He had a managing atmosphere, and sometimes I felt like I was imagining it talking to me, telling me things that weren't normal. I questioned my childish imagination and went over and over before I finally told my mom, and even then, it's hard to tell anyone something so crazy and expect them to believe you fully without thinking it's just your imagination. It's a child, what can you expect kind of deal. Years later, my cousin, who was 5 years younger than me, and maybe 11 at the time, starts sleeping in the same living room where I'd slept as a child, and sees this figure. Long since I'd given up on actually telling anyone what I believed this thing looked like, or the story behind my firm belief the house was occupied by something. My cousin woke up my uncle screaming. She was normally a very smart and quiet kid. Everything she did had a purpose, and to this day, it rings true to her personality. But that night, my uncle couldn't get into the room fast enough, and before he could even get out of bed, she was in his room, unable to give him any explanation. After she calmed down, she said there was a man, a tall dark man who had come through the French doors that are in front of the sleeping couch. She said that she couldn't move, and all she could do was watch him move closer, and then eventually stood and watched her, never moving. She said the only reason she made it out is because she willed herself to run out of the room like I did when I was a child. She saw it, full on saw this thing, and it had trapped her. Almost as if it had learned from its encounter with me as a child and wanted to be seen because I acknowledged it and refused to look at it. My cousin was absolutely blindsided by this event and would never come back to sleep in that room, ever again. Since then, it's felt like it was just a bad dream. Everyone pretty much knows the house is old and active, and everyone has some experience of some kind. Everyone literally chooses to ignore it all and chalk it up to being an old house with quirks. Being woken up in the middle of the night is definitely my uncle's chief complaint. He says sometimes it's a woman's voice saying his name, and he gets touched at least once a week. My mother now has to stay in his room because it's a small house. His room is located in a hall with a bathroom connected and across from the kitchen. It's well lit usually, and not at all creepy. But just the other night, my mother was going to the bathroom, and what she saw stopped her dead in her path as she drew in a gasp. It was a shadow man, tall at the ceiling with broad shoulders, standing next to the microwave in a very well-lit kitchen. And I mean well-lit, as in the lights are on, and there is a darker than black shadow, bigger than any human, standing in practically the middle of the room, and the light does not pass through it. She immediately went into the bathroom and tried to make sense out of what she saw. It was exactly what I had imagined in my mind's eye as a child. Large, broad, big and tall, dark, and had so much disdain and anger within. I sense it doesn't like women at all. While I was in high school, I had a really awesome job working security at a cemetery that was just a couple of miles away from my house. It literally was the graveyard shift, but I didn't mind it. For one, I never saw anyone out there, and 2, I was allowed to stay in my truck and listen to the radio all night. This was awesome, mainly because I didn't believe in ghosts, and also I got paid hourly just to listen to the radio. My enthusiasm for my job slowly dissipated as a couple of events that I can't explain occurred, slowly turning me into a believer. The first thing that happened that I thought was really strange was the odd mist that would only come in during the nighttime. This made shining my flashlight around the dark cemetery all that more difficult. I wrote off the mist as just being the cold weather during the night, a rather simple explanation. There were parts of the graveyard that I would avoid at night, not because I was afraid or anything, but mainly because my radio didn't get that great of reception. I would always get a blend of these 2 stations around this one tombstone, which I always thought was weird. It was the only part in the graveyard that it would do it. On the tombstone, the death date was June 6th, 2006. 666. I'm not superstitious, but I always thought that was weird. The next thing that I noticed that I thought was odd were the lights. When I say lights, I'm not referring to the lampposts. I'm referring to actual lights that floated and hovered around the cemetery. At first, I thought they were lightning bugs, but those typically give off a greenish-yellow glow for a few seconds. These lights that I would sometimes see were white. They did move slowly and didn't last for very long. I wrote this off as a mixture between the mist that hovered in the graveyard and the passing cars that would sometimes pass throughout the night. These lights didn't scare me, they just made me uneasy. It was as if the spirits of the graveyard were reminding me that I wasn't alone. The things that did scare me were the shadow people. I remember seeing my first shadow person. I thought someone had broken into the graveyard. At this point in my security career, I didn't believe in the paranormal. Because of that, the only rational explanation that I could come up with was that someone had broken in and that I needed to find them. I left my truck and chased after them. I obviously ended up empty-handed, as well as a good distance away from my truck than I originally wanted to be. On my walk back from my frivolous pursuit, I thought I heard whispering all around me. Normally, I would write this off as the wind in the trees, but I heard actual words, as well as my name, my full name. This obviously bothered me, and I spent the rest of the evening inside my truck. There was another time I was doing a patrol inside my truck while I was listening to the radio. I was disoriented with all the mist, and I hadn't realized I was near the 666 tombstone, and my radio went on the fritz. Instead of just merging 2 radio stations, I heard something very deep and growling coming from my radio. It told me the exact day I would die in a very demonic voice. This event wasn't nearly as scary, but a part of me is quite curious as to see if this would be correct. Granted, this experience was probably someone just fooling around on the radio late at night, but you better believe me when I tell you I have that exact date written down. The best ghost story I think I've ever heard was that of my best friend's aunt. The way that my best friend put it was that she was always interesting. She was a hippie and did drugs, but she always somehow had money. Like most people with money, they tend to collect things. My best friend's Aunt Margaret's case was that she collected porcelain dolls. Anyways, here's the story. In the mid-80s, Aunt Margaret was in her mid-20s. Like I said earlier, she did a lot of drugs, so I don't know how much of this is true. She was at a local flea market, going from booth to booth examining the different products that they were selling, when her eye caught a particular booth. The booth wasn't much different than the others. However, the woman sitting behind the booth was covered in jewelry. But that's not what caught her eye. Sitting next to the woman in jewelry was a large porcelain doll. The woman and the doll seemed to be having a conversation, obviously the doll not responding, but the woman responding for her, in a little girl's voice. The aunt, not being freaked out, approached the booth. She couldn't help notice the fine details that were on the doll. The doll was rather immaculate, and unlike any doll she'd ever seen. She simply had to have it for her collection, and asked the woman how much for the doll. The woman paused, and after a few seconds of silence, she finally shook her head, saying, "I can't sell this to you. However, I can give it to you, as long as you promise to talk to it every day." Seeing this as a great opportunity to acquire a nice doll for her collection, the aunt agreed. She took the doll home and, as promised, talked to the doll every day. Obviously, the doll would never respond, move, or even give off a bad vibe. Nothing out of the ordinary. However, around this time, the aunt was accidentally struck by a mail truck and had to be hospitalized for 2 days. This is where things took a turn for the worst. Upon arriving home, the aunt noticed that the home had a weird vibe to it. Instead of having a hip and chill vibe that the house normally had, the house was much more eerie, as if there was something there that shouldn't be. The dolls in the collection that normally sat on the shelf were on the floor, all except for the one doll. Her dogs and cats would seemingly avoid the doll at all costs. During the night, she swore that she heard someone talking in the other room. After investigating with her loaded pistol, she found that no one was there. She started to suspect that this paranormal activity was centered around this doll. To test her theory, she decided to lock that doll up in the attic. All throughout the night, she was able to hear what sounded like stomping with heavy boots coming from the attic. Rather than thinking of the doll, she actually thought that there was an intruder in her attic. After calling the police and having them investigate the attic, they found nothing. With everything that had happened and the circumstances surrounding how she acquired the doll, she finally decided to place the doll in an old trunk and to donate it to a thrift store. This would be the last time she'd see the doll, as well as the last time any activity would go on in the house. To this day, my best friend's aunt still collects dolls, despite everything that had happened. We ask her every now and then if she regrets getting rid of the doll or pawning it off onto someone else. She only responds with, "It's no longer my problem." I used to be a paranormal junkie back in my college days, and even after I graduated. I was a part of a group that would meet twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays, to plan and investigate haunted locations throughout the United States. Our group was surprisingly big for my town, and even though it wasn't a college-funded organization, we were allowed to use some of the buildings on campus to host our meetings. Most of the people in our group were older and didn't even attend the university, but we would always get new members every week or so to come with us on investigations. Most of our investigations were eerie, but if you are a non-believer, then it could get boring really quick. During my time with the group, we had to get permission from the place's owner to host our investigations there, which made things difficult considering most places didn't have an active owner, at least places worth investigating. There was one place 2 towns over we tried to get permission from, but the owners of the facility always declined our offer to investigate due to the buildings being unsafe for people to be inside. Unsafe in terms of structural integrity rather than paranormal danger. The place in question was an old hotel back in the early 1900s that had seen an unusual amount of deaths on the property. It was rumored that the hotel had to shut down due to the high levels of paranormal activity, and even to this day, passerbys would report sounds and sightings from the street alone. If people were reporting activity from the streets, then you know that this place must have been a gold mine. The group was very strict with its permission policy. We were not allowed to investigate, or we could face a lifetime ban if we were caught. This caused many people to follow the rules, however there were some diehard believers like me that were dying to investigate the haunted hotel. I was able to gather together some friends and rogue members of the group to go and investigate this hotel late one night. This turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes of my life. We met up together at the local Burger King and had dinner as a group and got ourselves mentally prepared for one of the best investigations yet. We were excited, yet also nervous due to us actually breaking the law by trespassing. Little did we know that we were nervous about the wrong thing. We drive over to the next town to where the haunted hotel is, and all of us are quiet in anticipation. Normally we are talking about what type of activity we'll most likely see or sharing personal ghost stories, but not on this ride. I think that most of us were getting in our own heads with the rumors of the high levels of activity, but we were also worried about being caught by the police. We finally arrived to the location. The building itself doesn't necessarily stand out, but you could tell that it's seen better days. We park our car down the street and hike up to the hotel. We walk around the hotel for about 5 minutes looking for an entrance, and we finally find one. However, it was less than ideal. Most of the doors and windows were boarded up with these thick, heavy boards. However, there was a board on the basement window that you could partially remove if you pulled on it. We were able to get all of our members inside the basement, even though we had to squeeze through. Once all of us were inside, we were able to begin our investigation. Right away, we felt uneasy. Thankfully, we had our equipment with us, as well as our flashlights. We were able to shine around the basement to see that the basement was mainly empty. Before we started investigating, we wanted to find the stairs that led up to the hotel. We considered that that would be the best place to find paranormal activity to document. After a 15-minute search, we were able to discover that the stairs were behind a closed door. While we were looking for the stairs in the basement, I felt a presence down there with us. Quick backstory about me. While growing up, I was able to see spirits as a child, but not very clearly, just more like their energy. For some reason in this basement, I was detecting very dark energy I've never came across before, or since. Rather than wanting to investigate, I just wanted to leave the basement as soon as I could. I didn't share this information with my group members, which I now consider a mistake. Looking back, we should have just left, right then and there. As soon as we found the stairs, we left the basement. Most of the group seemed relieved, although not by much. The hotel was rather empty and dark. For some reason, our flashlights didn't really seem to penetrate the darkness like they used to. The darkness seemed extra thick, almost as if it was a fog. We debated on separating into groups to investigate the hotel. We ultimately decided to stay together, which would probably be one of the only decisions I don't regret doing that night. While we investigated as a group, I saw one of the group members starting to light candles and placing them in a circle. She then pulled a board out of her bag. I immediately knew what she was doing. She was setting up a Ouija board. I'd only ever used a Ouija board once before, and that was at a party. Granted, I was pretty drunk and no one took it seriously. However, I was always kind of afraid of them. Being able to see energy is one thing, but it's another to set up a line of communication to who knows where. The person finished lighting candles in a circle, and we all sat down. Everyone put their equipment down and sat around the board. The person that brought the board began asking questions while all of us were touching the planchette. The girl that brought the board, her name's Megan, started to ask, "Is there anyone here with us?" At first, the planchette didn't move, but it slowly made its way over to the yes on the board. At this time, I felt a weird static in the room. The hairs on the back of my neck started to stand. Megan then asked, "Are you a boy or girl?" The planchette, rather somewhat quickly, spelled out girl. "How old are you?" Megan asked. The planchette moved to the number 7. Right after we got that answer, we heard a loud creak coming from the wooden floorboards behind us, as if someone walked behind us. We stopped playing, just for a moment, and shined a flashlight behind us. There was no one there. We then turned off the flashlight and hesitantly went back to the game. We then asked the female spirit, "What's your name?" The planchette spelled Mary. We then asked Mary how many spirits lived in this hotel. We didn't get a number, but it spelled out many. Before we could ask another question, the planchette moved to goodbye. One of the group members blurted out, "Wait, Mary, we're not done yet. Don't leave." The planchette remained motionless. Another group member then asked the board, "Is there anyone else here that wants to talk to us?" The planchette moved to yes. I then got that feeling again, that feeling of dark energy. The room got cold, and I felt the tingling on my neck intensify. We asked, "Are you a boy or girl?" The board spelled out, "Neither." As a group, we were kind of confused. Someone else then asked, "Well, how old are you?" The candle seemed to dim as it spelled out, "Never born." It started to dawn on me that whatever we were speaking to, whatever that I was feeling, was not human. I immediately wanted to stop playing, but the group insisted. They were curious as to whatever it was we were talking to. I nervously looked around the room as they continued playing. I was able to see something tall and dark standing in the corner. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The next few moments I don't really recall. I just remember a rush of energy and my sight going black. The next thing I realize, I'm being held down by my group. Some of the members are crying while others are yelling at me to snap out of it. I don't know what's happening and I start to freak out. Seeing that I'm back to normal, my group lets go of me and I stand up. Instead of trying to figure out what just happened, my group then ushers me into the basement, telling me that it's time for us to leave. In the rush of everything, I accidentally leave all of my equipment behind, and we make our way into the basement. While searching for the board that we entered from, we hear loud stomping coming from above us. We finally found the board that we entered and start making our way out. While we're leaving, I can hear loud whispers coming from behind us. I'm covered in tears and sweat and I don't know what's going on. I feel extremely fatigued, as if I just ran a marathon. But somehow the adrenaline in my system kept me from passing out. We finally all make it out of the basement and we run to the car that's parked down the street. We get in the car and we start driving home, most of us crying and in tears, while the rest are breathing heavy. While on the car ride home, I'm able to figure out what had happened when I blacked out. Apparently, during our session, when I blacked out, I stood up and started shaking, as if I was a newborn baby that had no idea how to walk. After a few seconds of struggling to walk, I finally stand upright. The group is able to see that my eyes are completely white. They then told me that I tried to attack a group member with my fingernails. It took 3 of the group members to hold me down, and that's when I came to. The whole ordeal couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds, but it was obviously enough to traumatize the group. That night was my last investigation. The group that met on campus caught wind of what had happened and kicked me out of the group. I obviously had no desire to go back anyways. However, it has crossed my mind once or twice to go back to the hotel to recover my old equipment, but deep down I know that that would be a terrible idea. One afternoon while my dad was at work, I was in my bedroom playing with Matchbox cars and other toys while my mom was in the kitchen, getting lunch ready for us. According to her, she heard me talking. This in itself wasn't out of the ordinary, as I usually would make sounds and create stories with whatever toys I was playing with. I had an incredible imagination back then, and still do thankfully. However, this particular occasion was different. She heard me carrying on one side of what sounded to her like a full conversation. As moms often do, she walked down the hall to the doorway of my bedroom and asked me who I was talking to. While I was sitting on the floor of my room, I told her very nonchalantly that I was just talking to the lady at the end of my bed. She played it cool and didn't show any sort of fear or apprehension about what I said, but later told me that since she was home alone with 2 small children at the time, that she was a bit freaked out. She asked the normal questions about this lady. Was she young or old? Was she nice or scary? Etc. And I, without slipping a beat, told her that she was nice and she was an older lady, apparently, who was simply inquiring about my toys and what I was doing. I didn't seem scared and acted as though it was no big deal. I will say that around this time, I did have an imaginary friend who I called Harry. But let me be clear that this was not Harry, and I never had more than one imaginary friend, that I can assure you. She and I have discussed this event only a couple of times in the years since, and I never gave it much more than a second thought. That is until my grandma, my mom's mom, somehow managed to bring up a similar but separate event later on. She would come and visit from Pennsylvania for months at a time, mainly to help with my mom, while my sister was at home while everyone else was at work. My grandma was a very serious, no-nonsense, but funny and gregarious old Polish woman. She wouldn't take any gruff, but was extremely loving and dotted us kids. When we picked her up from the train station one time, I was in junior high. We somehow got on the subject of ghosts and supernatural occurrences, when she said something to the effect of, "Then there was that time when I asked you who you were talking to in your room, and you said that you were just talking to the lady at the end of your bed." She had about the same reaction as my mom, according to her, and left it at that. If those two conferred about it together, I never heard of it, or at least until that day in the car with my grandmother. But apparently they did compare notes when my grandmother mentioned the occurrence to my mom. That day in the car though, I got chills. I had only ever heard this story from my mother, and for all I know before that, it just had been a dream or an occurrence that I'd managed to forget the bulk of. But the more I thought about it, the more I remember that particular time, that room, and having the benefit of photographic memory, I could almost see this lady in my mind's eye. She's older, silver hair, and had a gentle demeanor overall. That's about as far as my memory of her goes. I have never forgotten this story. As some of you may know, England is very rich with history, a very bloody history, that is. Needless to say, England is not a stranger to ghost stories. Having grown up here, I have a couple, but for the sake of time, I'll only share one. This one took place when I was a teenager, working in the city. I won't tell you the name of my city, but after hearing the description, you could probably guess it. I was working as a barista in a not-so-busy part of town. This was both good and bad for me. Good because I'm pretty lazy and didn't want to work, but bad because it was bad for business and my tips. The location, however, was quite unique. Our building sat on top of a World War II bunker for civilians when they were being air raided by the Germans. Our basement had a tunneling system that connected all the businesses underneath. As cool as this sounds, it's actually kinda creepy. We didn't keep that much inventory in our basement. In fact, all that was down there was a fuse box and maybe a couple of boxes. However, if and when the fuse would blow, one of us would have to go down into the basement. What makes this so creepy is that the tunnels are pretty dark, and allegedly haunted. Luckily for me, the first 2 years I worked there, I was not allowed to go into the basement. This is because only managers in our store were allowed to. However, once I got promoted to manager, everything changed. The first 6 months of being manager were great. I enjoyed the extra pay and did not have to go down to the basement for anything. However, everything changed when we got a new set of coffee makers. If we had more than 3 coffee makers going on at the same time, it would blow a fuse and turn off all of our power. This would then require me to go into the basement and find the fuse box and flip the fuse. Like I said earlier, the basement was an old war tunnel and connected to other businesses on our street. This was kinda cool that we all shared this basement tunnel together, but also kind of spooky. Whenever I'd go into the basement for any reason, I would always get this weird feeling in the back of my neck. It was kind of like static electricity, right before you're about to touch something metallic, like this buildup of energy. Anyways, back to my story. It was a dark afternoon. Well, I should say darker, considering England's pretty overcast for most of the year. It was our second week with the coffee makers. The fuse would blow about every other day, and we hadn't yet realized why it was doing that. I went down into the basement. The basement was eerily dark. The only source of light I had was a tiny flashlight that I had on my keychain. Needless to say, I was pretty spooked going down into the basement. Like I said, the basement was the tunnel that connected all the businesses above, so once I made it to the bottom of the stairs, I began my walk down the tunnel. The LED flashlight on my keychain that my mother gave to me for Christmas was proving quite useful, and yet I was not able to see that far down into the tunnel. As I was walking to the fuse box, that feeling of static electricity came to the back of my neck. For some reason, this would always heighten my senses, as if I was trying to look or to hear for something that was with me in the tunnel. I reached the fuse box and I opened it. There was a special sequence I had to do to get the fuses to work again, and I was trying to remember. While I was doing that, I could have sworn I heard someone walking down the tunnel. This was a good ways away, and it sounded like someone was slowly walking towards me, as if they didn't want to be heard. This made me nervous, and I tried my best to get the fuses working again. The sound of someone walking got louder and louder, as if whoever was down here with me was getting pretty close. I checked once or twice with my flashlight, but I never saw anyone down there. Granted, my flashlight only probably had about 20 feet of visibility. That's not very far. I then began to hear what sounded like someone whispering. Right when the whispering was getting louder, I was able to fix the fuse box and turn the breakers back on. The lights in the tunnel lit up and I was able to see I was in the tunnel alone. I quickly made my way up the stairs and into the cafe. After an hour or two of replaying the moments in my mind, I then began to realize that the tunnel was pretty old and carried sound very well. The walking sound that I heard that sounded like it was in the tunnel was probably from above. Same thing for the whispering. 3 days later, the same thing happened. The fuse went out and I had to go back into the basement. Except this time, I came prepared and brought a real flashlight instead of the dinky one on my keychain. I slowly crept into the basement, remembering the events only days earlier. I shined my flashlight all the way down into the tunnel and I could barely make out the other end. I was clearly alone in the tunnel, but it was always good just to make sure. As I began walking over to the fuse box, that same feeling on my neck began, except this time it was accompanied by this strong feeling of evil. I could tell whatever it was wanted to hurt me. I quickly jogged over to the fuse box. By this time, I was practically a pro, and it did not take me much time to get the lights back on. Instead of hearing sounds in the tunnel, I instead saw something. At the end of the tunnel looked like what appeared to be a man. It was at a distance at which you almost had to squint your eyes. This tunnel was accessible to the other businesses that were above it, so the idea that someone else was down there wasn't completely foreign. However, it was kinda creepy that he was down there in the dark. Being slightly creeped out, I gave a slight wave to ease my nerves. The man at the other end didn't wave. He just stood there. I quickly ran up the stairs and back into the cafe. I have since quit the cafe, and I sometimes think back about my experiences down in those tunnels. I often wonder what was down there with me in the darkness.